The pharmacy called at 6:40 in the morning while Elena Vasquez was still in the truck, waiting for the defroster to clear a windshield that had gone opaque overnight. The medication was ready for pickup. That was the good part. The refill would cost $340 with insurance, same as every month, and her account currently held $284. That was the less good part. She told the woman she'd be in Thursday and ended the call before being asked about the overdue balance, which sat at $680 and had been sitting there since August when Cora's fall specialist appointment cost twice what Elena had budgeted. By the end of this story, I'm also going to share something special with those of you who stick around to the end, something that can help you in your personal life. But first, let's get back to the truck's defroster worked on one speed, which was slow. Elena scraped the windshield by hand with a plastic scraper she kept wedged between the seat and the center console, working in circles while the engine ran, watching her breath turn to mist in the interior air. November in the Wallowa Mountains came without ceremony. Just a drop in temperature that happened overnight and stayed. She drove the forest road with her windows slightly down even in the cold, a habit she'd developed over 9 years of patrol work. You heard things before you saw them out here. Elk moving through underbrush. A tree weakened by rot finally giving out. The particular silence that meant snow was coming. The windows down wasn't about hearing specifically. It was about attention, staying porous to what the forest offered, not sealing yourself inside glass and heated air and whatever was going through your head. What was going through her head that morning was $56. That was the difference between what she had and what she needed, and she'd been running the same arithmetic since the pharmacy called because arithmetic was something she could control even when outcomes weren't. She made $22 an hour as a senior forest ranger for the Wallowa-Whitman National Forest. After federal taxes, Oregon state taxes, health insurance premiums that covered 60% of Cora's medication costs and 40% of specialist visits, and the $180 monthly minimum she paid on a credit card her ex-husband had maxed to $14,000 before leaving, her take-home was $2,400 a month. Rent on the small house she and Cora shared in Enterprise was $850. Utilities averaged $190. Gas for work and a 90-mile round trip to Portland every other month for Cora's rheumatologist was unpredictable but reliably expensive. Groceries, school supplies, the occasional thing Cora needed that wasn't medical. There was never anything left. There hadn't been anything left in 4 years. Cora was 7. She had juvenile idiopathic arthritis, diagnosed at 4 after months of Elena, watching her daughter wake up stiff and move through mornings with the careful deliberateness of someone twice her age. The medication keeping the disease from progressing to her joints permanently cost $680 a month before insurance, $340 after, and without it, Cora's immune system would continue the work it had already started, attacking cartilage and tissue with the indiscriminate efficiency of a body that couldn't distinguish self from threat. Elena had explained this to Cora's father, David, when he announced he was leaving. She'd explained it in the flat. Factual language she used when keeping emotion out of her voice required active effort. He'd nodded as though he understood. 2 weeks later, he'd emptied the joint account, which held $3,200, and driven to Arizona with a woman he'd been seeing for 7 months without Elena's knowledge. The credit card debt and a lease on a truck Elena already owned outright were his parting contributions to their shared life. She'd reported the account emptying to the bank. Was told it was a joint account, so the action was technically legal. She'd looked into what Arizona law said about abandonment and financial responsibility. The answers were complicated and required a lawyer she couldn't afford. She drove the patrol route. The forest in November had a particular quality she'd never found the right word for. Not dormant exactly. The ponderosas kept their needles. Larches had dropped theirs already, leaving the hills looking like someone had run a comb through them and left patches of bare gray. But the undergrowth was down, the thickets opened up, and you could see farther into the trees than in summer, and what you saw was the actual shape of the land beneath the foliage. Ridges and draws that summer hid. Rock outcroppings. The line of a stream channel cut generations deep into hillside. She turned off the main forest road at mile marker 14 and took the two-track that climbed northeast into the sections. The sections were what the Rangers called the older growth area that began roughly 2 miles past the trailhead and extended another 8 miles to the wilderness boundary. Old-growth ponderosa and Douglas fir, some of the trees old enough to predate the state. The undergrowth was dense in places even in November, rhododendron and Oregon grape thick enough to create walls between the large trunks. Hikers rarely went deeper than the maintained trails, and the maintained trails stopped at the wilderness boundary. Elena's patrol that morning was routine. She was checking for blowdowns from a wind event 3 days prior, documenting any road damage, looking for signs of illegal trail cutting that had been an ongoing issue since a hiking group had started promoting the area on social media without telling people it was technically off-limits past the boundary. She'd been doing this specific route for 6 years. She knew it the way she knew the floor plan of the house she'd rented since Cora was born, the way she knew the layout of the pharmacy where she picked up medication every month. Not consciously, more like a body knowledge, the kind that lives below attention, which is why the red shoe stopped her completely. She almost didn't see it. It was chest high on the tree, below her eye line when she was focused on the road surface, and the color had faded over whatever years it had been there, weathered from its original brightness to something close to rust. But she was looking up at that moment, checking the crown of a large ponderosa for widowmaker branches, and the peripheral movement of her scan caught the object on the trunk. She stopped the truck, got out. The tree was a ponderosa, maybe 3 feet in diameter at the base, its bark plated in orange-brown in the morning light. The shoe was nailed roughly 4 feet up, driven through the sole by a single iron nail. The head rusted to a brown that nearly matched the bark. Canvas uppers, child-sized, the kind of sneaker marketed to children in the 1970s, high-topped with a rubber toe cap, once probably bright red and now the color of old brick. Both laces were gone, rotted away, or removed. The interior of the shoe was a compressed mass of gray matter that might once have been padding or might be nest material from something small that had found shelter in it decades ago. Elena stood 6 feet from the tree and looked at it for a long time without moving toward it. In 9 years of forest patrol, she'd found objects that didn't belong here before. Lost gear from hikers. Abandoned camp equipment. A car battery once, for reasons she'd never understood. Hunting blinds built in areas where hunting wasn't permitted. She logged all of them, photographed them, followed protocol. A shoe nailed to a tree 4 feet off the ground was not the same category of thing. She took her phone from her jacket pocket and photographed the shoe from where she stood, then moved closer and photographed it from multiple angles. The nail was a cut nail, handmade looking, not the wire-drawn variety you'd find at a hardware store. That put it older. Pre-1900s possibly, though cut nails were still produced through the mid-20th century. The way it was set, straight through the center of the sole and driven flush against the bark, suggested it had been placed with deliberateness. Not carelessly thrown there, not the remnant of some long-ago prank. Placed. She looked at the bark below the shoe. Carved into it, about 8 inches beneath where the nail entered, was a small arrow, maybe 3 inches long, cut with a knife, the wood inside the carving dried and gray with age, but still distinct. The arrow pointed northeast. Northeast was the deep forest, the old-growth section, the area that saw maybe a dozen human visitors a year, and most of those were people like her, paid to be there. Elena photographed the carving. She went back to the truck and sat for a minute with the engine running. The protocol was clear. Document unusual finds. Report to station. Continue patrol. Investigate only if there was evidence of recent human activity suggesting emergency or law violation. A child's shoe and a carved arrow were not recent. Whatever they indicated, they'd been there for decades. There was no emergency attached to them, and no active law violation she could identify. She picked up the radio and called the station. Told dispatch she'd found what appeared to be an old marker of some kind, nailed to a tree. Photographed and logged. Then she sat for another minute thinking about the arrow. She drove northeast. The two-track ended at a locked gate 3/4 of a mile in. Beyond it was foot access only. Elena parked, took her pack from the bed, and clipped on the gear, she carried for extended patrols: water, first aid kit, radio, emergency blanket, her sidearm in the holster she almost never unsnapped. The morning was still. That particular quality of cold air in old-growth forest, with a large trunks, broke the wind, and the canopy absorbed sound, and the light fell in long shafts that had a physical quality, almost solid-looking, like something you could put your hand through. Frost on the undergrowth. Her footsteps loud on the forest floor. She was following a bearing northeast, which in this particular section of forest meant climbing. The land lifted in long rolls here, the ridges running roughly east-west, and the drainages cutting between them. She climbed the first ridge and came down into a draw where a seasonal creek ran, frozen now to a ribbon of gray ice that cracked under her boot when she tested it. She found the second marker 50 yards past the creek. A tin cup, rusted through in several places, nailed to a lodgepole pine at shoulder height. Below it, the same carved arrow. Northeast. Elena stood looking at it for a moment, then photographed it and continued. The third marker was a glass bottle, clear, old-fashioned in the way of drugstore containers from the mid-century, sealed with a cork stopper and nailed through the center with the same type of cut nail. The bottle was empty, or appeared empty. Below it, the arrow. She'd been walking for 40 minutes, and the bearing was consistent. Whatever the trail was, it had been laid out with intention, using a compass bearing rather than following the land's natural lines. The markers were spaced roughly 50 to 70 yards apart, which meant whoever placed them understood that visibility in this forest was exactly that. No more, no less. She found 4 more over the next hour. A leather strap, a coffee can, rusted and compressed by time, but still recognizable. A short length of rope, long since too brittle to serve its original function. A child's tin soldier, red-coated, the kind sold in dime stores before her parents were born. 8 markers total. 9 if she counted the shoe. And then the forest changed. She almost walked into the wall before she understood what she was looking at. The wall wasn't upright anymore. It listed severely, maybe 30 degrees from vertical, and was covered in moss, so thick the original surface was invisible beneath it. Moss and lichen and several decades of debris accumulation had softened all the edges and made the structure look like a natural feature until she was close enough to see that the shape beneath the growth was too regular, too angular, to be anything except construction. She stopped, took the scope from her pack, and looked at the surrounding area. No movement, no sound beyond the forest's ordinary voices, a wind sigh high in the canopy, a woodpecker working somewhere to her left. She circled the structure at 10 feet, getting the full shape of it. Roughly rectangular, maybe 20 feet by 30, single story, the roofline visible as a slightly different texture of growth from the walls. A chimney at the northwest corner, still, mostly upright, the stones it was made of visible through a gap in the moss. One door, on the south-facing wall, the opening visible as a darker rectangle because whatever had served as a door had either rotted away or was standing partially open. Not a hunting shack, too permanent in its construction. Log walls properly chinked. A real chimney. The dimensions of a habitation rather than a storage structure. Elena keyed her radio and reported her location and what she'd found. She received a crackle and a partial response from dispatch, who logged her coordinates and said they'd keep the line open. She told them she was going to investigate the structure for safety purposes. The door had been standing open, propped by a rock that had shifted over the years to a different angle than its original placement, which had let in weather and animals and everything else that came with decades of vacancy. She pushed through the opening and stopped. The smell hit her before her eyes adjusted. Decay, certainly an animal, and beneath both of those a faint trace of something like wood ash, an old cloth. The combination was the specific odor of places that had once been actively human and were now in the process of returning to the forest management. Light came through the gaps in the walls and through a window opening on the east side, the glass long gone. What she saw, as her vision adjusted, was a single room with a sleeping area on the north wall and a work area around the fireplace on the west wall. The sleeping area held a wooden frame that had partially collapsed but retained its basic geometry. The The rope lacing of a bed long since rotted through, a pile of what had been blankets compressed into a gray mass. The work area had a wooden table, still standing, one leg repaired with what looked like a length of iron pipe. On the table, weighted down by a stone, were papers. She didn't touch them. Not yet. She went methodically through the room first, logging what she found in her phone's notes. Photographs from every angle before touching anything. A shelf on the east wall held objects that had survived the years with varying success. 3 glass jars sealed with wax, their contents indeterminate. A set of hand tools arranged with the kind of care that suggested someone had placed them intending to return. 2 books, so degraded by damp that their covers were illegible and their pages had fused into solid masses. A tin box, sealed, that made a sliding sound when she gently moved it. Above the work table, nailed to the log wall with the same cut nail she'd seen on the trail markers, were photographs. They were black and white, printed on heavy paper stock that had survived the humidity better than the books, still recognizable, though faded to sepia in places. She leaned close without touching them. A child, a girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, in a dress and Mary Jane's, standing in what looked like a yard with a house visible behind her. She was squinting against sunlight, which was the 1960s way of being photographed. Not posed, just caught outdoors with the sun in the wrong place. Her hair was in 2 braids. She was laughing at something off camera. The same girl, older, maybe 11 or 12, sitting on a fence rail with her feet crossed at the ankle. Looking directly at the camera this time, composed, one of those old-fashioned school photograph expressions that children learn to produce. A name penciled on the back margin of the photograph, visible because the corner had curled away from the wall. Clara, a man, middle-aged, standing beside a truck in work clothes. Not a formal photograph. The kind taken to document an occasion rather than because anyone was thinking about posterity. His face was weathered, and he was not smiling, but the set of his eyes suggested he was comfortable being photographed, that someone he trusted was holding the camera. A family photograph, clearly an occasion. Christmas, by the tree visible at the edge of the frame. The man, the girl Clara, and a woman whose face was turned slightly, so only her profile was visible. The woman had her hand on the girl's shoulder. The girl was holding something wrapped in paper, tearing at the wrapping with the focused intensity specific to children in presence. Elena stepped back from the photographs and stood in the middle of the room. The papers on the table were what she should look at next. But she found herself not quite ready to, in the way that certain discoveries required a moment of preparation before you committed to what they might contain. She'd found abandoned structures in the forest before. Not common, but not unheard of. Homesteaders from the early 20th century, whose claims had lapsed or been absorbed into the forest system over time. Old mining operations, the occasional prospector's cabin. Hunters who'd built without permits and eventually stopped returning. This was different in a way she couldn't name precisely. The condition of the cabin and the photograph's vintage put the abandonment sometime in the 1970s or 1980s, not the early 1900s. The trail of markers was deliberate and maintained, which suggested someone had been here after the cabin was established and wanted to ensure the path was findable. The photographs were personal in a way that documented history wasn't, and the table held papers left under a stone as if someone expected them to be read. She approached the table and looked at the papers without lifting them. The stone had kept them from blowing around, but hadn't protected them from damp entirely. The top page had wavered with moisture absorption and drying cycles, but was still readable. A handwritten page, the handwriting careful and small. The ink had faded to pale brown, but remained legible. At the top, a date, September 4th, 1981. Below the date, a name and the beginning of what looked like a journal entry or letter. The name was Harlan Briggs. She photographed it and the pages beneath it without disturbing the stone. Then she put her phone back in her pocket and stood for a while longer, looking at the photographs on the wall. Clara laughing. Clara composed. A man with a truck. A family at Christmas. The forest was quiet around the cabin except for the woodpecker, still working somewhere south of her position, the rhythm of it patient and mechanical, the sound of something with a job to do. She went back outside into the cold, and keyed her radio again. She reported a cabin structure, long abandoned, historical materials inside, possibly predating Forest Service jurisdiction, requesting guidance on documentation and preservation protocol. Dispatch told her to photograph and log, that they'd run a records check on the section to see if there was any existing claim or historical designation. She spent another hour outside the cabin, photographing the exterior and the surrounding area, noting the construction details, the quality of the stonework in the chimney, the way the log walls had been joined at the corners with a dovetail notch that was more skilled than most frontier construction. Whoever built this had known what they were doing, had built it to last, had built it with the intention of staying. She didn't go back inside that day. She told herself it was a time issue, that her patrol had other sections to cover, that the cabin wasn't going anywhere and would be there when she returned with proper documentation equipment. All of that was true. The other true thing she didn't say out loud was that the cabin unsettled her in a specific way. The photographs on the wall, the table with papers weighted down, the personal quality of everything inside. It felt less like a historical site and more like a place where something had stopped mid-action, where someone had walked out the door, meaning to return, and hadn't, where time had frozen around the shape of a life and was waiting for something. She drove back to the station, filed her report, ate a sandwich at her desk because she'd forgotten to take a lunch break, called the school at 3:30 to confirm Cora's aftercare pickup. At home that evening, Cora sat at the kitchen table doing first-grade homework while Elena made pasta. She watched her daughter's focused frown over the math worksheet, the way she held her pencil tightly in the left hand, the way her feet didn't reach the floor and she swung them slightly when she was thinking. Cora had been having a good month. The medication was working. Her morning stiffness had decreased to something manageable, 15 minutes instead of an hour, and her rheumatologist had said at the last appointment that her inflammatory markers were down. Elena had sat in the car in the hospital parking structure for 6 minutes after that appointment before starting the engine, letting the relief move through her in whatever way it needed to. She put a bowl of pasta in front of her daughter and sat across the table with her own. "Did you find anything interesting today?" Cora asked this most evenings. She had a specific idea of what a ranger's day involved, shaped by books and television and the embellished versions Elena sometimes provided when the truth was too much paperwork and not enough wildlife. Elena thought about the red shoe, the 9 markers, the moss-covered cabin in the old-growth section, the photographs on the wall. "I found an old house in the forest," she said, "a really old one that had been empty for a long time." Cora looked up. Did someone live in it? Someone used to. A long time ago. Why did they leave? Elena turned her fork through her pasta. "I don't know yet." Cora accepted this with the equanimity she brought to most of Elena's non-answers, filed it somewhere, and returned to her math worksheet. Elena was at the station the next morning at 6:30 with a fresh battery in her camera and a tablet for detailed documentation notes. The records check dispatch had run overnight was waiting in her inbox when she logged in. The parcel in question, referenced by the GPS coordinates she'd submitted, was in an area incorporated into the National Forest boundaries in 1968. Prior to that, it had been private land. Ownership history, filed under Wallowa County Recorder, parcel 44-117-09. Multiple owners documented going back to a homestead claim in 1884. The most recent recorded owner before the federal acquisition was listed as Harlan Briggs, with a recorded deed dated 1957. The federal acquisition in 1968 had been condemnation, not a willing sale. The federal government had invoked eminent domain as part of the forest expansion program running through the late 1960s, acquiring private parcels to consolidate the forest boundary. The compensation payment to the recorded owner was listed in the summary, $4,200 for 47 acres. She read that number twice. In 1968, 47 acres of eastern Oregon timber and mountain land had been worth considerably more than $4,200 even at government valuation rates. The number suggested either a contested appraisal, a property in dispute, or a calculation that had served the government's interests rather than the landowners. She pulled up what public records she could access online. Harlan Briggs appeared in Wallowa County tax records through 1968. Appeared in Oregon State business filings from 1951 through 1967. A mining operation called the Briggs Canton Mineral Survey, registered in Baker County. Appeared in a newspaper archive she found through the Oregon Historical Society's digitized database. An article from the Baker City Democrat of June 1966, which described a dispute between a private landowner and the U.S. Forest Service over mineral rights to a parcel east of Enterprise. The article was 3 paragraphs. It said Harlan Briggs, 44, a geologist and mining surveyor based in Baker County, was contesting the Forest Service's position that his mineral survey claims had lapsed due to non-development. Briggs maintained that his surveys had identified viable gold and copper deposits on his property, and that the Forest Service's position on claim lapsing was inconsistent with established mining law. His attorney was quoted saying the case would be pursued through federal court. The Forest Service's regional office declined to comment. Elena sat back with her coffee. Harlan Briggs, a geologist, mining claims, a dispute with the federal government, a cabin hidden in the forest where he'd been the recorded owner before the government took the land. And then, 2 years after that article, the government acquiring the land for $4,200. And then, evidently, Briggs staying on the land anyway. She drove back to the cabin that morning. This time she went inside and spent 4 hours carefully documenting everything. She photographed every surface, every object, the fireplace interior with its layered ash deposits, the sleeping area, the collapsed shelf on the north wall she'd missed the first day that turned out to contain a wooden box with a fitted lid. The papers on the table she documented in order before lifting the stone. There were 11 pages, handwritten in the same careful script as the date she'd read the day before. Journal entries. The dates ran from September to 1981 through what appeared to be spring of 1984, though the final entries were fragmented and she wouldn't be able to read them properly without better light and possibly magnification. She photographed each page in sequence, front and back where writing appeared. The tin box on the shelf she left sealed. She had no authority to open privately owned containers, and until she understood whether the cabin's contents were legally federal property by virtue of being on federal land, or historical property belonging to an estate, or to something else entirely, she needed to be careful about what she disturbed. But the wooden box with the fitted lid was different. It was open, had been open for some time, the lid resting alongside it rather than in place. She photographed the interior. Inside the wooden box were papers in better condition than those on the table, protected by the box itself from the worst of the moisture cycles. Survey documents, she thought at first. Technical drawings with topographical markings and notations in a tight, precise hand. Then she looked more carefully at the notations. Mineral survey data, rock type, depth estimates, sample analysis figures, geological formation notations. The kind of documentation a professional geologist would produce from a thorough survey of land he owned and believed held value. At the bottom of the stack in the wooden box was a different kind of document. A formal paper, typed rather than handwritten, with a letterhead she couldn't read fully from the photograph she took without touching it. She could make out the words Mountain Resources and below that, a date, March 14th, 1963. And below the date, what appeared to be the beginning of a contract. She photographed the stack as best she could and left the box as she'd found it. On the way out, she stopped at the photographs on the wall again. The girl named Clara. The man she assumed was Harlan Briggs. The family photograph at Christmas. She leaned close to look at the woman whose face was turned to profile. Something about her posture, the way she held her shoulders, the angle of her jaw. Elena straightened. She was being sentimental, she told herself, finding meaning in the posture of a woman in a 60-year-old photograph because the situation called for significance. Before we find out what happened next in the story, I want to take a brief moment to speak directly to anyone watching who might be going through their own sudden, overwhelming transition. If you are navigating a bitter divorce, the loss of a spouse, or a financial shock, you know the hardest part isn't just the money. It's not knowing what to do first. That is exactly why we created the Phoenix Blueprint. It is a practical, step-by-step guide for starting over. It doesn't have fluffy affirmations or vision boards. is a tactical survival manual. It gives you the exact checklist for the first 48 hours, including the one rule you must follow. Do not make any decision you cannot reverse. It includes the Found Money worksheet, showing you exactly how to check state databases because 1 in 7 Americans actually has unclaimed money waiting for them right now. It even gives you word-for-word boundary scripts to use when family members pressure you for money or try to make decisions for you. You can get the entire guide right now for just $17. If you're watching on your TV, just pull out your phone, open your camera, and scan the QR code on the screen right now. If you're on a computer or phone, click the top link in the description. You don't have to figure this out alone. Now, let's get back to the story. She went outside into the gray afternoon and started the walk back to the truck. That evening, she ran Harlan Briggs through every database available to her. The Oregon Mining Claim Registry, Federal Land Records, Oregon Death Records through the State Vital Statistics Office, property records in Baker, Wallowa, and Union counties. What she found came in pieces over 3 evenings. Harlan Briggs, born 1922 in Pendleton, Oregon, educated at Oregon State, Geological Engineering, class of 1947. Worked for several mining companies through the 1950s before establishing his own survey operation. Married in 1954 to a woman named Ruth Harmon. One child, Clara Jean Briggs, born 1958. Death record for Ruth Briggs, 1967. Cause listed as automobile accident. Death record for Clara Jean Briggs, none. Missing persons record, this one she found through the Oregon State Police Archive, accessible through her ranger credentials. Clara Jean Briggs, age 10, reported missing July 14, 1968, in Wallowa County. Case status: unsolved. Last known location: the family property on the Sections Road, outside Enterprise. Elena read the missing persons file twice. Clara had gone into the woods. A summer afternoon, her father working on the property, she'd gone out with a dog that had reportedly come home without her by evening. Search and rescue had spent 3 weeks in the area. No trace found. The case file noted that the timing, July 1968, was the same year the federal government had initiated the condemnation of the Briggs property. The case file had a note added in 1971. Harlan Briggs had contacted the Wallowa County Sheriff's Department to report that he believed his daughter's disappearance was connected to individuals who had been pressuring him to sell his property and mineral rights before the condemnation process began. He named 2 individuals. The note indicated his claim had been investigated and no connection found. The note was signed by the investigating deputy. The last property tax record for Harlan Briggs was 1968. After that, there was no trace of him in any database she could access. No address, no tax filings, no death record, no record of leaving the state, no record of staying. He disappeared the same year his daughter disappeared and his land was taken. But the cabin existed. The cabin was lived in, maintained, documented through 1984 at minimum by the journal dates. The trail of markers was deliberately placed and maintained by someone who knew the forest and knew the bearing to the cabin. Elena sat at her kitchen table with her laptop and Cora asleep down the hall and thought about a man who had lost his wife, then his daughter, then his land, and who had apparently continued to occupy that land for at least another 16 years by living in a cabin in the old-growth section where nobody would look for him. She thought about the mineral survey documents in the wooden box. The letterhead she hadn't been able to read fully. Mountain Resources and a date in 1963. She thought about the tin box she hadn't opened. Then she pulled up the Oregon Historical Society Digital Archive and searched Mountain Resources, Oregon 1963. The search returned a result she hadn't expected. Mountain Resources Incorporated, a mining development company based in Portland, had been active in eastern Oregon from 1961 through 1989. It had developed 3 major gold and copper operations in Baker, Grant, and Wallowa counties during that period. In 1989, it had been acquired by Pacific Continental Mining Corporation, which was itself absorbed by a company called Cascade Mineral Holdings in 2004. Cascade Mineral Holdings. She wrote the name down. She searched further, found a Forbes article from 4 years ago, part of a profile on private resource companies in the Pacific Northwest. Cascade Mineral Holdings, Portland-based, privately held, estimated value $420 million. Her coffee had gone cold. She didn't notice. She went back to the survey documents she'd photographed, zoomed in on the letterhead image on her laptop screen. The image was slightly blurred because she'd photographed it through the wooden box rather than moving it. But she could read more of it now with the screen's magnification. Mountain Resources Incorporated, Portland, Oregon. And then, in smaller print below the company name, Mineral Survey and Partnership Agreement. An agreement between Mountain Resources and Harlan Briggs. In 1963, 5 years before the government took his land, she thought about what an agreement in 1963 might mean in the context of a company that had since become worth $420 million. She thought about a man living in the forest for decades, his daughter missing, his land taken, staying anyway, not leaving, not starting over somewhere else. She thought about the trail of markers that began with a child's shoe nailed to a tree. Elena closed her laptop and sat in the quiet house for a long time, listening to the sound of her daughter breathing down the hall, the ordinary sound of a child in an untroubled sleep. In the morning, she went back to the cabin. This time she brought a flashlight with fresh batteries, a proper documentation kit, and the specific intention of opening the tin box. She arrived at 8. The forest was clear and very cold, the frost heavy on the undergrowth, each frond and leaf outlined in crystals that would be gone by 10. She went directly to the cabin, pushed through the door with the same scraping resistance as before, stood a moment waiting for her vision to adjust. The cabin was exactly as she'd left it. The photographs on the wall, the papers under the stone, the wooden box open on its shelf. She lifted the tin box carefully. It was roughly the size of a shoebox, the metal cold and dense in her hands. The lid had a simple closure mechanism, a bent tab of metal that folded over the lid's edge. She released it. Inside, layered in oilcloth that had done its job well, were documents that looked different from everything else in the cabin. Crisper, better preserved. The oilcloth packaging had sealed them against the damp, and they'd survived whatever the cabin had experienced over the intervening decades. She put the tin box on the table under the window and carefully laid out the contents. A folded letter, the paper thick and official, addressed to Harlan Briggs and dated June 1963. At the top of the letterhead, printed in the formal block type of the era, Mountain Resources Incorporated, Portland, Oregon. A second document, a contract, 12 pages, signatures at the end. Harlan J. Briggs, party of the first part. Mountain Resources Incorporated, party of the second part. A mineral survey and partnership agreement. A third document, a share certificate. Mountain Resources Incorporated. Issued to Harlan J. Briggs. 40,000 shares of common stock. Date of issue, August 16, 1963. A fourth document, another share certificate. Same company, same name, 20,000 additional shares. Date of issue, March 22, 1965. A sealed envelope at the bottom of the tin box, thick, addressed in the same handwriting she recognized from the journal pages, to whoever finds this. Read it carefully, then decide what it means. Elena set down the share certificates and looked at them for a long time. 60,000 shares of Mountain Resources Incorporated, issued 1963 through 1965. Mountain Resources Incorporated, acquired by Pacific Continental Mining Corporation in 1989. Pacific Continental acquired by Cascade Mineral Holdings in 2004. And somewhere in those corporate transitions, 60,000 shares belonging to a man who disappeared into a forest. She reached for the sealed envelope. She stopped herself. Not here. Not in a cabin in the middle of the forest where she had no means of verifying anything, no reference point, no one to witness what she read. She documented everything with the camera. Every page, every certificate, every detail of the tin box and its oilcloth lining. Then she carefully replaced everything exactly as she'd found it and sealed the tin box. She had a decision to make. The professional decision was clear. This was a historical find on federal land. It needed to be reported, the contents needed to be cataloged and turned over to the appropriate authority while the ownership question was sorted out. The other decision, the one sitting behind the professional one and refusing to be fully looked at, was the question of the sealed envelope. And what was in it? And whether its instructions had been meant for anyone who found this cabin, or whether Harlan Briggs had somehow known exactly who would come. She stood in the cabin with the photographs on the wall and the cold light coming through the frameless window and thought about her daughter, 7 years old, sleeping in a house in Enterprise with an immune system that fought her from the inside. She thought about the $56 gap between what she had and what she needed, about the $14,000 on a credit card that had been spent by a man who had abandoned them both without looking back. And then she thought about Clara, about a 10-year-old girl who had walked into this forest and not come home, about a man who had stayed, who had built markers from objects that meant something, who had left a sealed tin box and a note that said, "Read it carefully, then decide what it means." She looked at the girl and the photograph on the wall. Clara, laughing at something off camera, her braids slightly undone, the summer yard behind her. Then she looked at the family photograph one more time, at the woman whose face was turned to profile, at the particular set of her jaw and the angle of her shoulders and the way her hand rested on the girl's shoulder, the way her own mother used to stand. Elena left the cabin and walked back through the frosted forest toward the truck, her footsteps slow and deliberate. The woodpecker was back at its work somewhere to her left, methodical and patient. The frost was beginning to lift from the undergrowth, each ice crystal releasing itself. As the temperature climbed toward freezing, the light in the old trees had that quality again, long shafts of it between the trunks, heavy and slow and full of what it fell on. She drove back to Enterprise in a state that wasn't quite thought, more like the period after thought, when the mind has received information it cannot fully process and is simply moving through time while the processing happens at levels below attention. At home that evening, she went to the cardboard box in her bedroom closet that held the few things that had survived her mother's death when Elena was 16. A handful of photographs, a wristwatch, 2 letters written in her mother's hand, a photograph album with half its pages empty because her mother hadn't been a person who documented things. She found what she was looking for near the back of the album, a photograph she'd looked at once, years ago, and filed away as family history too distant to be relevant. Her mother at maybe 30 years old, standing in a yard, the same squinting expression as someone photographed with the sun in the wrong place. Her mother's maiden name, which Elena had never thought much about because her mother became Ruth Harmon when she married and Elena had known her as nothing else. Elena had assumed Harmon was simply a name from somewhere she'd never looked into. But the woman in the family photograph on the cabin wall, the way she'd held her shoulders, the angle of her jaw. Elena sat on the edge of her bed with her mother's photograph in one hand and thought about a man named Harlan Briggs who had a wife named Ruth and a daughter named Clara and a piece of land in the Wallowa Mountains and a tin box with 60,000 shares of a company that had eventually become Cascade Mineral Holdings, worth $420 million. She thought about her mother, who died when Elena was 16 in a car accident that had been called an accident. She thought about her own father, Robert Vasquez, who had left when Elena was 9 and whom she had never tried to find because the effort had always seemed disproportionate to the likely return. She thought about the sealed envelope at the bottom of the tin box. Read it carefully, then decide what it means. She put her mother's photograph on the bedside table and sat for a long time in the quiet house, listening to the distant sound of a car on the road outside, the tick of the heating vent, the ordinary sounds of a life that was about to become something she couldn't predict. She waited until Cora was asleep. That was a rule she hadn't stated to herself, but had followed without breaking, because whatever the envelope contained, she didn't want to read it with her daughter in the room. She wasn't sure why. Maybe because she didn't want Cora to see her face in case what she read required a face she couldn't control. Maybe because whatever Harlan Briggs had written in that sealed letter was private in a way that went beyond the official, beyond the documented, and Cora, at 7 years old, had already absorbed more of her mother's private fears than any child should have to carry. She made tea she didn't drink and sat at the kitchen table where the light was best and opened her laptop to the photographs she'd taken in the cabin. The sealed envelope on her screen, The handwriting clear in the photograph. To whoever finds this, read it carefully, then decide what it means. She'd been back at the cabin that afternoon with a colleague, Marcus Tillett, one of the senior rangers who covered the adjacent district and who had the kind of seniority that meant paperwork moved faster when his name was on it. She'd explained what she'd found, walked him through the cabin, watched him photograph things she'd already photographed. He'd agreed the tin box needed to be removed to the station as a precaution against further weather damage, and they'd logged it out under the Historical Finds Protocol, which assigned it a case number and put it technically under federal jurisdiction pending a determination of whether the contents had any active legal relevance. What she hadn't told Marcus was that she'd already photographed every page of the tin box's contents on her personal phone during her second visit to the cabin. She'd had no authority to do that. She didn't examine that fact too closely. At home, on her personal phone, she had images of everything, including the envelope. She'd printed the photographs that afternoon at the drugstore on South River Street, paying $4.80 for a set that now sat in a folder on the table in front of her. She took out the image of the envelope, then the image of the share certificates, then the pages of the survey agreement she'd been able to photograph before her angle and the wooden box's depth had cut off the fine print. Then she opened the folder image of the letter on the table, the one addressed to Harlan Briggs for Mountain Resources in June 1963, and read what she could make out. Dear Mr. Briggs, further to our survey agreement of February this year, we are pleased to confirm the findings of the geological assessment conducted by your team on the above-referenced property in Wallowa County. The copper and gold deposit identified at the northern boundary of your claim represents a commercially viable extraction site. Mountain Resources Incorporated is prepared to offer the following compensation for your ongoing survey partnership rights and for the mineral development agreement as outlined in Schedule A. The rest of the visible text was cut off by the angle. But what she'd seen was enough. Harlan Briggs had found something real on his land before the government took it, and he'd entered a partnership agreement with Mountain Resources before that taking. The shares issued to him in 1963 and 1965 were payment for that partnership. She put the photographs down and got up and moved around the kitchen in a circuit she'd been making all evening, from the table to the counter to the window that looked out over the dark yard and back to the table. The arithmetic of it was something she could feel building in her chest, a pressure between what she was allowing herself to think and what the numbers actually suggested. Cascade Mineral Holdings valued at $420 million. 60,000 shares issued to Harlan Briggs. But how many total shares outstanding? She'd searched for the figure and found only estimates. A Forbes article noting the company was closely held among a small group of founding investors and their successors. No public disclosure, no SEC filings because they weren't publicly traded. She needed a lawyer. She needed someone who understood corporate securities, mining law, and the specific mechanics of what happened to share ownership when private companies merged with other private companies over a period of 6 decades. She didn't have money for a lawyer. She sat back down at the table and looked at the printed image of the envelope. Whatever Harlan Briggs had written, he'd sealed it and left it in a tin box wrapped in oilcloth inside a cabin in a forest that no one visited. He'd placed 9 markers along the trail to make sure someone could find the cabin. He'd kept the markers over the years because the objects were nailed with the same cut nails throughout, and no single weather event would have driven them all in the same style. He'd maintained the trail deliberately, refreshing it, ensuring that someone walking a compass bearing northeast through that section of forest would find their way. He'd expected someone to come. He'd left instructions. She got up and went to the drawer where she kept the things that needed to be kept but didn't have a better category. Her mother's wristwatch, Cora's hospital wristbands from her diagnosis admission, a handwritten receipt from the landlord before they switched to electronic payments, her own birth certificate, which she needed to produce for a federal background check when she'd been hired. She opened her birth certificate and read it, which she hadn't done in years. Elena Rose Vasquez, born April 3rd, 1992, in Boise, Idaho. Mother, Linda Ruth Vasquez, née Harmon. Father, Robert Luis Vasquez. Boise, Idaho. She'd known she was born in Idaho. Her mother had moved to Oregon when Elena was 4, after Robert Vasquez left, settling in Bend first, and then later in Portland for work. Elena had thought of Idaho as simply the place she was born, without particular relevance. One of those biographical facts that carried no narrative weight. She opened her laptop and searched Clara Jean Briggs, Wallowa County, Oregon, 1968 missing. The Oregon State Police Archive came back with what she'd already read. The case file. Age 10. July 14, 1968. Unsolved. She searched differently. Jane Doe, Idaho, 1968 girl. The search returned a database entry she hadn't found in her earlier searches because she hadn't thought to look in Idaho. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children's Historical Database, updated as part of a digitization project in 2019, contained an entry for an unidentified female child, approximately 9 to 11 years of age, found in Owyhee County, Idaho, in August 1968. Dark hair, brown eyes, minor injuries consistent with extended time outdoors without shelter. No identifying information. The child had been unable or unwilling to provide her name. She had been placed with a family in Nampa. The placing family's name was listed as Harmon. Elena sat with that for a long time without moving. Harmon was her mother's maiden name. Linda Ruth Harmon, born in Boise, raised in Nampa, who had told Elena almost nothing about her childhood beyond that it had been ordinary and that she had been adopted by a family who had been kind but not warm, the way some families were capable of care without connection. Her mother had left Idaho at 19, moved to Portland, met Robert Vasquez, had Elena. Had never talked about her family of origin. Had told Elena once, when Elena was about 12 and asking questions about grandparents, that her birth family was something she'd closed the book on and that some stories were better left where they were. Elena had accepted that answer because at 12 you accepted the answers your parents gave you. You didn't understand, yet that the answers people didn't give were sometimes the ones that mattered most. She pulled up the Wallowa County case file again, the missing persons report for Clara Jean Briggs. The physical description: dark hair, brown eyes, approximately 4 feet 4 inches, slender build, a small scar on the left knee from a fall at age 7. Elena's mother had a scar on her left knee, a small one, white with age, that she'd sometimes touched absently when she was thinking about something else. Elena had never asked about it. She closed the laptop very carefully, the way you handled things when your hands weren't entirely steady, and sat in the kitchen in the quiet house listening to the refrigerator's hum and the distant sound of wind moving through the pine at the edge of the yard. Her mother was Clara Briggs, or her mother had been Clara Briggs, before trauma at age 10 had taken that name away from her and given her a different life and a different family and a series of closed books that she carried until a car accident in Portland in 2008 had closed the final one. And somewhere in the old-growth forest outside Enterprise, in a tin box, now sitting in a metal evidence locker at the ranger station, was a letter from the man who had spent the rest of his life in a cabin in the woods because he could not leave the last place where his daughter had been real. She went back to the station early the next morning, before her shift technically started, and told the duty officer she needed access to the historical finds case for approximately 30 minutes. He logged her in without questions because she was senior staff and had her own reasons for things, and she sat in the evidence room with the tin box and the sealed envelope, and her phone's camera, and a witness log she'd been required to sign. She photographed the envelope unopened. Then she opened it. The pages inside were 3, written front and back on the same heavy line paper as the journal entries. The handwriting was the same careful small script, but the pressure of the pen had changed somewhere near the end of the second page, becoming less controlled, as if the writer had been sitting for a long time and his hand had finally registered what the rest of him already knew. The date at the top was May 1991, 9 years after the last journal entry she'd been able to read on the table. She photographed each page before reading a word. Following the protocol she'd assigned herself, documentation before response. Then she put the phone down and read. He wrote, I have been on this land for 23 years. I am 69 years old. I know I won't be here much longer, and I want to write this down while I can still get the words right. I want to say first that I am not a man given to sentiment. I was trained as a geologist. I spent my life reading rock and trying to understand what it contains and what it means. I believe in evidence. I believe in what can be measured and verified. I say this so that whoever reads this letter understands that what I am about to write is not the product of a desperate old man's wishful thinking. It is what I found, documented, and verified over the course of a decade. He wrote, Clara was 10 years old when she walked into this forest on a July afternoon and did not come back. For 3 years, I believed she was dead. The search had found nothing. There was no body, which could have meant anything or nothing in country that dense. I told myself she was gone and tried to live with that, which is not the same as accepting it. You don't accept the loss of a child. You just learn to carry it differently as the years go by, and the carrying becomes such a familiar weight that you mistake it for your own body. In 1971, I told the sheriff's office what I knew about the men who had been pressuring me to sell my mineral rights. Their names were Gareth All and a man everyone called Dutch, whose legal name I later determined was Hendrik Voderen. They worked for a company called Pacific Survey Partners, which was itself a subsidiary of a larger operation whose name I did not learn until later. They had come to my property 3 times in 1967 and twice in 1968, always when Clara was present, always making their presence felt in ways that had no legal definition but were unmistakable in their intent. They wanted what was under my land, and they wanted me to accept their terms. I refused both times. Clara disappeared 6 weeks after their second visit in 1968. The sheriff's office told me there was no evidence connecting All and Voderen to Clara's disappearance. I believe they were not wrong. I believe those men were not directly responsible. What I believe, and what I have spent years trying to prove, is that my refusal to sell and the subsequent federal condemnation were not coincidental, and that the pressure I faced in Clara's disappearance were products of the same machinery, even if the specific hand that caused them was not the same. He wrote, in 1979, I had a letter from a woman named Bernice Hallett in Nampa, Idaho. She had seen a notice I had placed in several Pacific Northwest newspapers every year since Clara's disappearance. Bernice was 73 years old and had been a social worker in Owyhee County during the late 1960s. She told me that in August 1968, a girl approximately 10 years old had been found wandering near the Oregon border, severely disoriented and frightened, with no identification and no coherent account of how she had come to be there or where she was from. The girl had been placed with a family in Nampa through the county placement system. Bernice had handled the placement. She had kept her own records, as she described it, because something about the case had stayed with her, because the girl was clearly not a neglected child, but a child who had experienced something she could not find words for, and because no family had ever come looking. I drove to Nampa in the fall of 1979. I met Bernice Hallett, and I reviewed her records. The girl's physical description matched Clara. Age, coloring, build. The timing matched. Owyhee County borders Malheur County in eastern Oregon. A child walking or being driven from Wallowa County in July 1968 could have ended up in the area where she was found. The family that had taken her and had registered her under the name Linda, given her their surname Harmon, and raised her as their adopted daughter. By 1979, she was 21 years old, had left Nampa, and had no contact with the Harmon family beyond the occasional car to holidays. Bernice had an address for her in Portland, a young woman going by Linda Ruth Harmon. I went to Portland. I sat outside her apartment building for an hour before I understood that I could not simply present myself to a 21-year-old woman whose entire constructed life rested on not knowing what had happened to her at age 10. If the trauma of whatever she had experienced in that July forest was still inside her under lock and key, and I had no reason to believe otherwise, then my arrival would not be a gift. It would be a demolition. I left Portland without knocking on her door. I told myself I would return when I had thought through what to say and how to say it. I was 57 years old. I had been living in a forest for 11 years. I did not know how to give someone back a life they had buried. I never went back. He wrote, I tell you this because I want you to understand why the tin box exists and why I left it the way I did. The shares in Mountain Resources represent 23 years of surveying work and 2 years of partnership with a company that went on to build something considerable. When they acquired the rights to my claims and paid me in equity rather than cash, I thought I was being shorted. A geologist who understood the deposit I'd identified on that land would not have accepted stock in a company over cash. But I was 40 years old and needed to feed my family, and cash was immediate and stock was speculative. I was wrong about the speculation. I have watched from this forest as mountain resources became something larger than I understood. I do not know what it is worth now, because I cannot exactly walk into Portland for a financial newspaper. What I know is that 60,000 shares of a company that was buying mineral operations in 3 counties in the early 1960s, and that had the financial backing that allowed it to acquire rather than simply survey, is not a small thing in the context of what these mountains contain. The shares are real. The certificates in this box are genuine. The mineral partnership agreement is enforceable as far as I know, though I am a geologist and not a lawyer, and what happens to equity through corporate mergers and acquisitions is something I understand only in the abstract. What I know is that someone should have this. Someone who needs it. Someone who followed the markers I laid down because they had run out of other options. If you're a family, which I hope you are, I apologize for the silence. I was a man who knew how to read rock and did not know how to read people. And I made the choices that men like me make, which are the choices of someone more comfortable with geology than with grace. The trail led you here. You earned whatever it contains. His name at the bottom, Harlan John Briggs. And below the name, a date, May 14th, 1991. And below that, in a hand that had clearly set down the pen and picked it up again, I found some of the old survey maps in the back of the bureau. The copper vein runs along the northern ridge. Whoever buys this should know that. If you find someone who needs to know, Elena photographed every page twice and sat in the evidence room for 10 minutes after she'd finished reading, looking at a wall of gray industrial shelving that held other boxes from other cases and feeling the specific weight of being told something true by a dead man who had never met her. Her mother had been 10 years old. She had walked into a forest in July. She had ended up in Idaho. She had spent the rest of her life with the book closed. Elena had spent the last 4 years calculating the $56 gap between what she had and what Cora needed. And in this evidence room, in the pre-shift quiet of a Tuesday morning, she understood that she was sitting in front of 60,000 shares of a company worth $420 million, and that she had no idea what that actually meant or what she was supposed to do with it. She left the tin box in the locker and went to do her job. She spent 3 days thinking before she made any move. She did her patrol routes. She helped Cora with homework and made dinner and took the truck in for an oil change she'd been putting off for 6 weeks and paid for it with the last of the money she'd set aside for small repairs. She did not tell anyone about the letter or what it had told her about her mother. On the 4th day, she called a number she'd kept in her phone for 2 years without using. Catherine Park, an attorney she'd met at an Enterprise Chamber of Commerce event, who practiced property and estate law out of a small office on Main Street. Elena had taken her card because you never knew when you'd need a property lawyer, and because Catherine Park had a straightforward manner that suggested she didn't dress things up. She called and said she had an unusual legal question and couldn't yet assess whether she could pay for a consultation, but that the matter might be significant enough to be worth an initial meeting. Catherine Park said, "Come Friday at noon." Elena brought the photographs, all of them, in a folder. She spread them across Catherine Park's desk and explained what she'd found and what she'd learned and what she'd concluded about the connection between Harlan Briggs and her mother. She explained it in the order she discovered it, not the order that made the best argument, because she decided that presenting it as an argument would make it sound like she was trying to convince someone of something, and what she needed was an honest assessment of whether she had anything. Catherine Park had the photographs of the share certificates for 7 minutes. She looked at each one, turned several over, held one up to the window light. These are authentic. The printing method and paper stock are consistent with 1960s corporate document production. I've seen similar certificates from that era. The question isn't whether they're real. The question is what happened to these shares when Mountain Resources was acquired. That's what I need to know. Corporate mergers have rules about shareholder notification. When one company acquires another, existing shareholders are entitled to be notified and offered conversion or buyout of their equity. The law requires reasonable effort to reach all registered shareholders. If Mountain Resources converted all shares to Pacific Continental stock in 1989 and Harlan Briggs was never notified, that's a problem for Pacific Continental, and by extension for Cascade Mineral Holdings when they later absorbed the operation. But Harlan Briggs was living in the woods. He wasn't exactly reachable. That's the complication. The company can argue they sent notifications to his last known address, which was the Wallowa County property that by 1989 had been federal land for 20 years. They can argue they made reasonable effort. Whether a court agrees with that characterization is a different question. Catherine Park set down the photographs. The other question is your standing. You believe you are the granddaughter of Harlan Briggs. That connection runs through your mother, who herself was operating under an assumed name and identity for her entire adult life. Establishing that Linda Ruth Harmon was Clara Jean Briggs is not a simple task, and the evidence you have is circumstantial. Elena had expected this. Physical description. Matching timeline. Idaho County bordering Eastern Oregon. Social workers' records from a placement in 1968. My birth certificate shows I was born in Boise in 1992. Circumstantial. A DNA test would be definitive if there are any existing biological samples for comparison. A court order could compel Cascade Mineral Holdings to produce Harlan Briggs's shareholder file, if such records still exist, which would contain his address and personal information and potentially documentation of attempts to notify next of kin. How long would this take? Catherine Park looked at her with an expression that combined professional candor with something that wasn't quite sympathy, but was in the same neighborhood. To do it properly, and you are to do it properly, a minimum of 18 months. Possibly 3 to 5 years if Cascade contests aggressively, which they will. You are describing a claim against the largest privately held mining operation in the Pacific Northwest. Their legal budget will exceed anything you or I can produce. Elena thought about Cora's medication, about the $14,000 credit card, about the $56. I need to understand what the shares are worth before I decide how far to take this. That requires a corporate valuation attorney, someone who understands mining, sector equity, and the specific mechanics of what happens to shareholder value through multiple mergers. That's not my area. She recommended a man named Douglas Tay, a Portland attorney who handled complex mining and resource cases, who was known for taking contingency work when the underlying claim was strong enough. She wrote his name and number on a card and handed it across the desk. She said the initial consultation would cost Elena nothing. Whether Douglas Tay thought the claim was strong enough to take on contingency was a different matter. Elena thanked her, asked what the consultation had cost. Nothing yet. Call me after you've talked to Tay. If this is what you think it is, we'll discuss structure then. She drove back to Enterprise through the late afternoon light that turned the eastern hills amber, thinking about the word structure and what it implied about the scale of what she might be standing in front of. Douglas Tay had offices on the 14th floor of a building in downtown Portland that Elena visited on her day off 2 weeks later, having arranged for Cora's after-school care with the Mortons next door. She took the bus from Enterprise because the truck had developed a sound on hard braking that she didn't trust on the highway, and she arrived in Portland feeling the specific combination of exhaustion and resolve that long bus rides produced. Douglas Tay was 52, compact, wearing a suit that suggested he was the kind of lawyer who appeared in court rather than just writing letters. He had a manner that was precise without being cold, and he listened to Elena's account without interrupting, occasionally making a note on the legal pad in front of him. When she finished, he asked 4 questions. Were the photographs of the certificates taken before or after the tin box was removed from the cabin? Before, on her personal phone, during her official documentation visit. Was the cabin on federally administered land at the time of discovery? Yes, incorporated into the National Forest in 1968. Did she have documentation of the historical records, check that established Harlan Briggs as the last recorded private owner? Yes, in the station's digital record system. And did she have any independent corroboration of the connection between her mother and Clara Briggs beyond the circumstantial chain she described? She did not have independent corroboration. She had the printed photograph of her mother, the physical description from the missing persons report, the Idaho placement record she'd found through the NCMEC database, and the fact that her mother had been raised by a family called Harmon in Nampa. Douglas Tate made a note. He sat back and was quiet for a moment, which was a different kind of quiet from distraction, the kind where someone was running calculations. The shares, if your hereditary connection can be established, and if the merger notifications failed to reach the registered shareholder through any means that satisfies Montana and Oregon corporate law, represent a significant claim. Mountain Resources issued 180,000 shares total at incorporation. Your grandfather held 60,000, which is 1/3 of the original float. When Pacific Continental acquired Mountain Resources in 1989, the conversion was 1.1 shares of Pacific Continental per Mountain Resources share. That would have made 66,000 shares of Pacific Continental. When Cascade Mineral Holdings formed in 2004, Pacific Continental shareholders received 0.85 Cascade shares per Pacific Continental share. That conversion produces 56,100 shares of Cascade. He turned his notepad around so she could see the figures. Cascade Mineral Holdings has 225,000 shares outstanding. That's documented in a 2021 financing disclosure they made to a consortium of lenders, which is one of the few public documents they've produced. Your potential 56,100 shares would represent 24.9% of the company. He paused. Their most recent independent valuation was $420 million. Yes, but that's a conservative number for financing purposes, designed to support collateral, not to represent actual market value. 3 analysts who have written publicly about Pacific Northwest resource sector companies have placed Cascade's real value between $600 million and $800 million. At the midpoint, 24.9% ownership would be approximately $175 million. The number landed in the room without drama, which was somehow worse than if he'd delivered it with weight. Just a number, stated clearly, the way someone states numbers when they've said large ones before and know that the person hearing it needs time. Elena said nothing for a moment. Then, what's the path? He outlined it. First, establishing the hereditary connection was critical and had to come before anything else. He could commission a forensic genealogist to run the Idaho records, the Owyhee County placement files, any surviving Harmon family records from Nampa, and match them against the Briggs missing persons case. If Clara Briggs's DNA had been taken as part of the missing persons investigation, which was unlikely in 1968 but worth checking, comparison against Elena's DNA would be definitive. More likely, they'd be working from documentary evidence alone, which would build a strong circumstantial case rather than a definitive one. Second, he would contact Cascade Mineral Holdings through a formal letter asserting Elena's ownership claim. He would outline the basis for the claim, attach copies of the share certificates, and request documentation of the 1989 and 2004 shareholder notification processes. The company's response to that letter would tell him a great deal about how they intended to proceed. Third, in parallel, he would file for a court order requiring Cascade to produce Harlan Briggs's original shareholder file, including any correspondence sent to him during the merger periods and any records of whether his shares have been formally declared abandoned or lapsed. The filing fee was $750. His hourly rate was $380. He would take contingency cases. Given the potential value of this one, he would consider a modified arrangement. She would cover the filing fees and a small retainer of $2,000 to demonstrate commitment, and he would absorb the bulk of his hours against a 22% contingency if the case produced a recovery. $2,000 and $750. Elena had $1,100 in her account and was 12 days from her next paycheck. I can have $750 in 3 weeks, she said. The $2,000 will take me 2 months. Douglas Tay looked at her for a moment. The filing fees can wait until you have them. We can start the genealogical work now. I'll use one of my contract researchers who works on retainer. In the meantime, I'd like you to put together everything you have on your mother's background. Birth records if you have them. Any documentation of her early life in Idaho. Anything your mother ever said, however small, about her childhood or her family of origin. It builds the record. She took the bus back to Enterprise and arrived after dark. Cora was asleep. Mrs. Morton had left a note on the counter saying she'd had 2 helpings of dinner and done her homework without complaint. Elena stood in the kitchen in her coat and thought about $175 million. She thought about it the way you thought about a number that had no referent in your actual life. Without feeling. Without the reflexive emotional response that a smaller, more plausible number would have produced. It was too large to produce a feeling. It sat in her mind like an object in a dark room that you knew was there, but couldn't see clearly. She fed the cat, checked on Cora, and slept more deeply than she had in weeks. The next 6 weeks were a period of surface stillness and subsurface activity that Elena managed in the margins of her regular life. Patrol routes and station reports and Cora's school pickups and the pharmacy that she was now current on. Having received a small tax refund, she'd applied directly to the overdue balance. She compiled everything she had on her mother into a folder she sent to Douglas Tay's researcher, a woman named Priya Anand, who communicated primarily by email and asked questions that were efficient and specific. Address of birth hospital, any known relatives in Idaho, whether Linda Harlan Vasquez had ever applied for a Social Security card, and if so, what year, whether any naturalization records existed. Elena answered what she could and noted where the gaps were. 3 weeks into Priya's research, an email arrived that contained a single PDF attachment. The PDF was an Owyhee County Department of Social Services placement record from August 1968. A document Priya had obtained through a combination of a public records request and the assistance of a retired archivist who apparently knew where the old paper records had been stored when the county digitized its files. The document confirmed the placement of an unidentified female child, age estimated 9 to 11, with a Harmon family in Nampa. Physical description: dark hair, brown eyes, small scar left knee, approximately 4 feet 4 inches. The document also contained a detail Elena had not found in the NCMEC database. A handwritten note in the margin, added by the placing social worker, Bernice Hallett, whose name Harlan had mentioned in his letter. Child will not give name. Responds to sound of Clara. Has not spoken except to ask for water. She read that sentence 3 times. She forwarded the email to Douglas Tay and called him immediately after. He was already composing the letter to Cascade Mineral Holdings when she reached him. This document, combined with the Briggs missing persons report and the physical match, is strong. Not conclusive, but strong. A judge would look at this seriously. More importantly, Cascade's lawyers will look at it seriously, which matters more in practical terms, because this is likely to resolve in negotiation rather than trial. When will you send the letter? Tomorrow. I want you prepared for a period of silence. Companies like Cascade have legal departments that are good at taking time. They'll need 2 to 3 months minimum to assess the claim and formulate a response. Don't read anything into the silence. It doesn't mean they've dismissed it. She asked him to send her a copy of the letter when it went. It arrived in her inbox the next morning. Formal, precise, attaching copies of the certificates and the survey agreement and noting the documentary chain supporting Elena's hereditary claim. The letter requested a meeting within 60 days to discuss the matter in good faith. It noted that Elena was a federal employee, a fact that Douglas had chosen to include without elaboration, and that the share certificates were currently in federal custody as part of a historical fines investigation, which was technically accurate. The letter also contained one paragraph near the end that Elena read twice. We further note that our client's review of public financial documents indicates that Cascade Mineral Holdings has reported its share structure to lenders on multiple occasions in recent years and has not disclosed the existence of approximately 56,100 shares held in legacy equity from the Mountain Resources founding. Whether this omission was inadvertent or strategic is a question we will address fully if this matter proceeds to discovery. She was in the parking lot of the station when she read it on her phone. She sat in the truck for a moment, looking at that paragraph. Douglas was telling Cascade that he knew they'd hidden a block of shares. That accusation, if true, was not just a civil matter. She called him. He answered immediately. You read the letter. That last paragraph is accurate. Their 2021 financing disclosure lists 225,000 shares outstanding and describes a shareholder base of 14 individuals. If your grandfather's 56,100 shares were properly carried through the mergers, the total outstanding would be 281,100, not 225,000. The 14 shareholders on record have collectively been receiving dividends and exercising voting rights based on a denominator that excludes your family's stake. That's a serious problem for them. Has this happened before? With other companies? Rarely in this form. Usually these situations arise because estates are poorly administered, not because of deliberate omission. Whether Cascade knew about these shares and made a calculation to exclude them, or whether the records were simply lost in the merger transitions, is something we'll find out in discovery. Either way, their exposure is significant. 2 weeks after the letter was sent, Elena's supervisor at the ranger station, a man named Garrett Poole who had been in the district for 18 years and whose management style was a steady, low-temperature skepticism toward anything that deviated from established protocol, called her into his office. He'd received an inquiry from the regional legal office about the historical find on her patrol route. The tin box and its contents were now the subject of a formal review because, Garrett explained with the expression of someone delivering a headache, a company called Cascade Mineral Holdings had contacted the regional counsel's office after receiving a letter from a Portland attorney about said contents. Elena sat across the desk from him and kept her face neutral. The regional counsel wants to know about the chain of custody, Garrett said. How the contents were documented before the box was removed. Whether proper protocol was followed throughout. She told him, accurately, that she had photographed the scene before and during removal, that she had followed historical finds protocol, that Marcus Tillett had been present for the removal, and that the box was currently logged in the station's evidence system. Garrett looked at her for a moment. You have a personal interest in this. She said she had discovered information suggesting a possible family connection to the land historical owner. She had disclosed this to a private attorney and had taken no official action outside her professional role. The regional counsel is going to want you to hand this over to the agency's legal office. Whatever claim you think you have, running it through the station while you're employed here is a conflict. I understand that. He leaned back. Elena, I'm going to tell you something that's outside my role to say, and I'm going to say it anyway. If you genuinely have a claim here, protect it. Get it out of the agency's system and into your own attorney's hands before anyone decides the federal custody of those certificates is convenient for someone else. I don't know what Cascade is worth or what those certificates represent, but they were in a box on private land before the government took that land for $4,200 in 1968. And if you're who you say you are, the government's acquisition of that land does not make its contents the government's property. She thanked him. He waved it off and picked up his phone to signal the conversation was over. She went back to her desk and emailed Douglas Tay. Cascade has already contacted the federal agency. We need to move faster. His response came in 40 minutes. I anticipated this. The certificates are evidence in your civil claim. I'm filing a protective order tomorrow. Get me the evidence log number for the tin box. She sent it from the station system. That evening, she sat at the kitchen table while Cora watched a nature documentary in the other room, the sound of it floating through the wall, something about ocean creatures, and she thought about Harlan Briggs in his cabin. 23 years in the forest. A geologist who knew how to read rock and had left behind an inventory of what the land contained. 60,000 shares. A copper vein along the northern ridge. A trail of markers beginning with a child's shoe nailed to a tree. Her mother had been 10 years old when she walked into that forest and did not come back. Had spent the rest of her life with a sealed memory and an assumed name and whatever quiet knowledge lived below the seal. Had never talked about her childhood. Had touched a scar on her knee, sometimes without seeming to know she was doing it. Elena thought about the way grief lived in the body when the mind refused it. How it found expression in other forms. In distance, in closed books, in a childhood described as ordinary, in a past described as something better left where it was. She got up and looked at her mother's photograph that she'd put back in the album. Her mother at 30, squinting in a yard, the sun in the wrong place. Linda Ruth Harmon Vasquez, who had been Clara Jean Briggs for the first 10 years of her life and hadn't known it for the rest. The nature documentary continued in the other room. Cora was narrating along, which she always did with documentaries, adding her own commentary, asking questions of the television. Elena leaned in the doorway and watched her daughter for a moment in the blue light of the screen, 7 years old and unaware that the arithmetic of their lives had shifted under them while they were going about their days. She did not say anything. She went back to the kitchen and read Douglas Tay's filing instructions a second time and made the notes she needed to make. And she thought about what Harlan Briggs had written in his letter. A man more comfortable with geology than with grace, who had read rock his whole life and had understood at the end that what he'd found in the earth was less important than the question of who it would reach when he was gone. Cascade's formal response came 41 days after the letter was sent. Douglas called her at 7 in the morning, which told her something before he spoke. They're offering $4 million. She was standing in the kitchen in her work uniform, Cora eating cereal at the table, the morning normal in every surface way. For everything? For full release of any claim against the company, a non-disclosure agreement, and quiet title to a section of the federal land if we can get the agency to agree to transfer it, which is a separate issue they're being optimistic about. $4 million against a claim of $175 million. Douglas's voice was steady and professional. It's an opening position. It tells us they've had their lawyers look at this seriously enough to make an offer at all. A company that believed it had no exposure would not offer $4 million. They would offer nothing and force us to court. What do? We reject it. We counter at full value. We continue building the documentary case, and we wait for their next move. Elena looked at Cora, who was pushing cereal around her bowl with a spoon, reading something on her tablet, unaware. Reject it, she said. Counter at full value. I'll have a letter to them by tomorrow. Be prepared for things to move more slowly now. Their offer means they're engaged. It also means they've hired outside litigation counsel. This is the part that takes time. She put down the phone and poured herself coffee she needed but hadn't made yet and stood at the kitchen counter thinking about time. About 18 months to 5 years. About $340 a month and $14,000 on a credit card, and a daughter whose body fought her from the inside and who needed what she needed regardless of corporate timelines and litigation calendars. She thought about Harlan Briggs, who had waited 23 years in a forest because he had nowhere else to go and nothing else to do except stay on the land and watch the trees grow over the evidence of what had been taken from him. She poured the coffee. She sat down across from Cora and asked about the cereal and about the tablet, whatever Cora was reading, giving the morning its ordinary shape while something that would not be ordinary moved below it, slow and enormous, the way tectonic things moved, patient as geology. Outside, the November light was coming in pale and flat through the kitchen window, the yard still frosted, the pine at the edge of the property standing very still in the cold. She went to work. The months that followed were not what Elena had expected, though she wasn't sure what she had expected. Not drama, exactly. Not the sustained urgency of discovery. What she got instead was waiting, and the waiting had a texture she hadn't anticipated. Life continuing in its normal shape, while something enormous pressed against it from the outside, patient and unrelenting, the way a river pressed against a rock it was slowly moving through. She patrolled her routes. She filed her reports. She made dinner and helped with homework and drove to Portland in February for Cora's rheumatology appointment, which went well, the markers still down, the rheumatologist cautiously using the word stable. She stopped at the pharmacy on the way back and paid the $340 with money she'd scraped from a tax refund and a small overtime payment. And she drove the 90 miles home through the dark with Cora asleep in the passenger seat and thought about what stable meant in the context of a body that was always negotiating with itself. Douglas Tay called in January, then again in February, then twice in March. The calls had a similar shape. He reported what had happened, told her what was coming next, and did not tell her how he thought it would resolve, because he was a careful man who understood that telling clients how he thought things would resolve led to conversations he couldn't control. What he told her in the January call was that Cascade had retained outside litigation counsel, a firm in Portland that specialized in natural resources disputes, which meant they were taking the claim seriously. What he told her in the February call was that the agency's legal office had been persuaded, through the protective order, to treat the tin box as evidence in a private civil matter rather than as federal property, and that the certificates were now formally in his custody as evidence for the claim. What he told her in March, the first call, was that Cascade had filed their formal response to the claim, rejecting it on 3 grounds. The first ground was that the hereditary connection between Elena Vasquez and Harlan Briggs was insufficiently established by documentary evidence alone. The second was that under Montana abandoned property law, the shares had legally reverted to the company in 1994 after 25 years without shareholder contact, a process Cascade maintained was properly executed with notifications sent to the last known address of record. The third ground was that the 1968 federal condemnation of the Briggs property had extinguished all private claims connected to the property, including any mineral partnership agreements executed prior to that condemnation. That last one, Douglas told her in the second March call, is wrong. It's a reach, and they know it's a reach. The mineral partnership agreement was between Harlan Briggs as an individual and Mountain Resources as a company. The federal condemnation of the physical land did not affect equity held in a private corporation that happened to have surveyed that land. Those are legally distinct things. They're throwing it in because it sounds good, and they're hoping we won't push back hard. What about the abandoned property ground? That's the real fight. If they sent notifications to the Wallowa County property address in 1994 and that address was federal land for 26 years by then, the notification was technically sent to a known last address, even though that address had changed jurisdictions. Whether a court would accept that as reasonable effort to locate a living shareholder is the question. It's not clean for either side. And the hereditary connection? Priya is working on it. She found something in the Owyhee County records I want to tell you about in person. Can you come to Portland next week? She came on a Thursday, Cora in school. The truck making its braking sound all the way down the highway that she'd been nursing along with the careful driving habits of someone who couldn't afford a repair bill. Douglas's office had a view of the West Hills that on a clear day was considerable, and the day was clear. Priya Anand was 34, efficient, and had the manner of someone who spent most of her time with documents and was comfortable in that company. She sat at Douglas's conference table with a folder that was thicker than any folder Elena had seen associated with this case. Bernice Hallett kept everything, Priya said. After she died in 1994, her daughter held onto the storage unit. The daughter is 71 now and lives in Boise, and when I found her and explained what I was looking for, she was cooperative. Bernice had personal case files for every child she placed during her 22 years as a social worker. Personal files, not official ones. The official county records were sparse. Bernice's personal records were not. She opened a folder and produced a photograph. It was a Polaroid, faded but intact. A girl sitting on a porch step, her knees pulled to her chest, looking at something to the left of the camera. Dark hair, cut short in a way that suggested someone had dealt with tangles by removing them. Brown eyes, though the color was harder to read in the faded photograph. A small scar visible on her left knee. The girl was 7 or 8 in the photograph, not 10. Priya had already anticipated the question. Bernice dated all her photographs on the back. This is dated March 1966, 2 years before the girl who was placed with the Harmons. It was in Bernice's personal file under the name Briggs, Clara, written in Bernice's handwriting. Bernice knew this girl before 1968. She had encountered her in an official capacity, a school welfare check in Wallowa County in 1966, and taken a photograph as part of her personal documentation practice. The girl in the 1966 photograph and the girl placed with the Harmon family in August 1968 were the same child. That was Bernice's own annotation, written in pencil on the back of the 1968 Polaroid she'd also kept. Same child, 2 years later, Briggs case. Elena looked at the photograph for a long time. The girl in the photograph looked nothing like Cora, but she looked like Elena's mother had looked in the early photographs, before she was grown, before the years had put their work into her face. The set of the shoulders, the way the knees were pulled up, the shape of something closing of a gap between then and now being bridged by a social worker who had kept her personal files for 28 years because something about the case had stayed with her. As she'd written to Harlan, as she'd told him in person, something about the case had stayed with her. Priya had more. She'd found the original Oregon State Police evidence log for the Clara Briggs missing persons case, which in 1968 had included collection of a hair sample from Clara's bedroom, a standard procedure even then, preserved in the OSP evidence archive because the case had never been formally closed. The sample was degraded, but testable with modern techniques. She had already spoken to a forensic laboratory in Eugene that handled cold case biological evidence. A DNA comparison between Elena and the preserved sample would provide near-definitive confirmation of the hereditary connection. The test costs $1,400, Priya said. I can arrange it if you're willing. Elena said yes before Douglas had finished nodding. The sample came back 6 weeks later. The comparative analysis produced a conclusion stated in the flat technical language of forensic reports. The submitted DNA from Elena Rose Vasquez is consistent with a granddaughter relationship to the individual whose biological material was preserved in the Clara Jean Briggs evidence sample. The statistical probability of this relationship versus an unrelated individual is 99.7%. Douglas sent the report to Cascade's counsel with a cover letter that contained 2 sentences beyond the attachment description. We trust this resolves any questions regarding our client's hereditary standing. We are available to discuss settlement at your convenience. Cascade's counsel asked for 30 days to review. Douglas gave them 21. The response came on a Wednesday morning. Douglas called her before 8 a.m., which she'd learned meant news of significance because he was a person who respected normal business hours. They've retained a second opinion firm, another genealogist, and a separate DNA lab. They want to run their own analysis on the OSP sample. Can they do that? They can request access through the cold case review process. The OSP has discretion. It'll take another 2 months. She exhaled slowly. 2 months. I want to tell you something. Their request for a second analysis is not the action of a company that believes the first analysis is wrong. It's the action of a company looking for a procedural foothold to delay a result they already know is coming. We should use the 2 months productively. He had been waiting, he said, to receive the discovery documents he'd requested through the pre-litigation process. The court order he'd filed in November had produced a partial response from Cascade, some internal documents relating to the 2004 restructuring and the shareholder registry. He'd been reviewing them. There was something she needed to understand before the second analysis came back and negotiations intensified. He sent her a PDF that afternoon. Internal Cascade documents from 2004, produced under the court order. A memo from their legal department dated March 15, 2004, during the restructuring process that created Cascade Mineral Holdings from Pacific Continental's assets. The memo was 3 pages. Its subject line read, Pacific Continental Legacy Equity Review, Unresolved Shareholder Accounts. Elena read it at her kitchen table that evening with Cora in the other room, watching her nature documentaries and providing commentary to the television. The memo identified 11 shareholder accounts from the Mountain Resources founding era that had not been converted or resolved during the 1989 Pacific Continental acquisition. Harlan John Briggs, 60,000 original MRI shares, was listed as account 7. The memo noted that notifications had been sent to his last known address, the Wallowa County property, in 1990 and again in 1992. Both had been returned as undeliverable because the address was by then federal land with no resident. The memo further noted that in 1994, the company had applied Montana's abandoned property statute to declare the shares lapsed, but had not filed the required regulatory notification with Montana's Unclaimed Property Division. That last sentence was the sentence Douglas had flagged in bold in his email. They skipped the regulatory filing. The abandoned property declaration requires notification to the state, which then creates a public record that allows heirs to locate and claim abandoned equity. They didn't do that. Whether they forgot or whether someone decided that creating a public record of 60,000 unresolved shares was inconvenient. The result is the same. The abandonment process was never legally completed. The shares are not voided. They're in a kind of legal limbo that favors your claim significantly. She read the memo again. Then she looked at the list of 11 accounts. 7 of them had notes beside them, resolved. 4 had notes that said pending review. Harlan Briggs's was one of the 4 pending. They had known since 2004. They had done an incomplete job of addressing it and left the incomplete job sitting in a file for 20 years. She put her phone down and sat very still at the kitchen table, listening to Cora narrate a documentary about migratory birds, the sound of her daughter's voice carrying the specific pleasure of being interested in something. Garrett Poole called the following week. He had retired 6 weeks earlier, which she hadn't expected, and was calling from a cell phone rather than the station number. He asked how she was doing, and she said, "Fine, managing." He said he'd heard from his former colleague at the regional legal office that the Cascade situation was developing. He asked her directly whether she had found what she thought she'd found. "Yes," she said. "I think so." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I worked for the Forest Service for 18 years. I processed paperwork on 14 eminent domain acquisitions. I never looked into what the government paid the original owners until you started asking questions about that Briggs parcel. I looked it up after you did. $4,200 for 47 acres in 1968, at a time when comparable private timberland in Wallowa County was selling for $200 to $300 an acre. The compensation was wrong. I don't know what the right outcome is legally, but I wanted to say that to you." She thanked him. They talked for another few minutes about nothing significant, and then he said he hoped things worked out and ended the call. She went back to her reports and didn't think about what he'd said until later that night, when she was trying to sleep and couldn't. Not because she was anxious, or not only because she was anxious, but because something in what Garrett had said had opened a door she hadn't been looking at. The acquisition in 1968. The $4,200. The mineral survey agreement with Mountain Resources that had been signed in 1963, 5 years before the government took the land. The federal government's condemnation of a property whose owner had just entered a commercial agreement to develop its mineral deposits. The timing had always been there. She noted it early on and filed it away. But lying in the dark, now, she thought about what Harlan had written in his letter. He had suspected the condemnation was not coincidental. He had named 2 men. He had described pressure and then Clara's disappearance, and then the government acquisition in the same sequence. He'd been told there was no connection. She thought about that, about what no connection meant when the person doing the looking was a deputy in 1971 and the person being accused was connected to a company with the resources to make connections difficult to find. She didn't know if any of this could be proved 50 years later, or what proving it would accomplish, or whether the legal case she was already building was the right place to address it, or whether it was a separate thing entirely. She knew that the mineral deposits identified in Harlan's survey, the copper vein along the northern ridge, had become part of what Mountain Resources developed into a company now worth hundreds of millions of dollars. She knew her grandfather had been paid in equity rather than cash for his partnership, and had then lost the land itself to a government process he believed was corrupted. She knew that what she was trying to recover through Douglas Tay was the equity, the labor of a geologist who had read the rock correctly and whose reading had built something that outlasted him. She finally slept, and in the morning she made breakfast and drove Cora to school and went to work. Cascade's second DNA analysis came back in April. The result matched the first, 99, for percent probability of granddaughter relationship to Clara Jean Briggs's biological sample. Their counsel requested another 30 days. Douglas gave them 2 weeks. They reconvened by video call, Douglas and Elena on one side, Cascade's lead attorney and 2 colleagues on the other. The lead attorney was a woman named Margot Finn, somewhere in her 50s, with the particular composure of someone who had spent decades in rooms where very large amounts of money were on the table. She opened by acknowledging that Cascade accepted Elena Vasquez's hereditary connection to Harlan John Briggs. That concession, delivered without preamble, shifted the room's atmosphere in a way Elena felt before she understood it. We remain of the view that the abandoned property proceedings in 1994, while procedurally incomplete, were conducted in good faith, Margot Finn continued. However, in the interest of resolving this matter without the time and expense of litigation, we are prepared to discuss a negotiated settlement. Douglas nodded. What is Cascade prepared to offer? Finn's expression did not change. $40 million. Structured as a buyout of all legacy equity held by the estate of Harlan John Briggs and its heirs, full release of all claims, non-disclosure agreement, and a land easement that would allow your client access to the cabin site for personal or historical purposes. Douglas looked at Elena. She kept her face neutral. He said, "Our position is $155 million, representing fair market value of the legacy equity at current conservative company valuation. My client is not asking for a premium. She is asking for fair value for equity that was earned, documented, and never properly resolved. The land easement," Finn said, "has significant value to our client that we'd encourage you to weigh. I appreciate that. But access to a cabin in a national forest does not offset $115 million. Finn said they would need to consult with their client. The call ended. Douglas looked at Elena from his office in Portland, her image from her kitchen table, the distance between them made ordinary by technology. He said they'll move. 40 to 80, probably, before they start coming up seriously. The memo about the abandoned property filing being incomplete is the problem for them. If that becomes part of a court record, other legacy shareholders from the Mountain Resources era may become aware. They have 3 other unresolved accounts from that same 2004 memo. They don't want a class action. The other accounts, Elena said. He nodded. I've been aware of that. If this case goes to court, discovery would surface the memo, and those other accounts become findable. That's leverage we haven't used explicitly yet. Finn knows it's there. 3 weeks later, Cascade came back at $75 million. Douglas countered at $145 million. 2 weeks after that, $95 million. He countered at $138 million. She was on patrol when the next call came. Walking the section boundary where she'd been checking for illegal trail cutting, the forest floor soft with late April rain, the understory starting to green up. She stepped off the path and stood between 2 large Douglas firs with her phone pressed to her ear, while Douglas told her Cascade had moved to $112 million. They're running out of room, he said. One more counter. I'm going to go to $130 million. I think they settle between $118 and $125 million. That range gets them out of this cleanly, avoids the class action risk, and lets them maintain their shareholder registry in private. What do you think I should do? His voice stayed measured. I think you should understand what the numbers mean after fees and taxes. At $120 million, my 22% is $26. $4 million. Federal and state taxes on the gain, depending on how we structure it, would take approximately $39 million. You would net roughly $54. $6 million. At $125 million, you'd net approximately $57 million. She stood between the Douglas firs and looked up through the canopy at the gray sky and thought about $54 million. About what it meant in actual terms. About Cora's medication, which at current trajectory represented perhaps $4,000 a year for the next decade. About the credit card with $14,000 on it. About the truck making its braking sound and the rent that was $850 a month and the pharmacy's overdue balance. She thought about Harlan in his cabin for 23 years. About what he'd built and what had been taken and what he'd hidden because he understood that visible wealth made you a target and that only desperate people were humble enough to use it well. She thought about her mother's scar. About a child who had walked into this forest and spent the rest of her life not knowing where she'd come from. Take it to $130, she said. If they come back with $120 or above, accept it. He accepted for her $122 million on a Tuesday morning in May, 3 days after Cascade's final offer arrived and 2 days after Elena had told him, in a call that lasted 4 minutes, that the number was acceptable and he should proceed. The settlement agreement was 63 pages. She read all of it. Douglas walked her through every provision. The payment structure, the non-disclosure terms and their scope and limits, the release of claims, the land easement that gave her permanent access to the cabin site and the surrounding 2 acres for personal and historical purposes, a provision she had specifically requested and that Cascade had agreed to because it cost them nothing and appeared to buy goodwill they were calculating they needed. She signed with a pen she'd bought at the gas station, a $2 ballpoint, because she didn't own a good pen and it had seemed unnecessary to acquire one for the occasion. The wire transfer was scheduled for 30 days after signing. She did not tell anyone. She told Douglas she needed those 30 days before the money arrived to think about what she was going to do, and he said that was her business and that he'd send her a list of financial advisors he trusted, which she could use or not use as she saw fit. She thanked him. He told her it had been the right case and that he was glad it had worked out, and she believed him. She went home and made dinner and helped Cora with a project about state geography and watched the news without absorbing any of it and went to bed at 10:30. In the 30 days, she called no one. She had no one obvious to call. Her aunt in Albuquerque, whom she hadn't spoken to since Cora's diagnosis 4 years ago and who existed at the edge of her life as a person who sent late birthday cards. No close friends in Enterprise, only the colleagues and the Mortons next door and Walt at the hardware store who had helped her with the truck twice and whose friendship was built on the solid but narrow foundation of practical assistance. No one who was owed an explanation or a sharing of news. She thought about what people did with sudden wealth and whether she was one of those people now and what the correct posture was toward a change of this scale. What she decided over those 30 days was that the posture was no different from the one she'd always used. You looked at what needed doing, and you did it in order of what mattered most. You didn't rush, and you didn't perform, and you didn't let the size of the number convince you that you needed to become a different person to manage it properly. The notification arrived on the 30th day, a Thursday. An email from her bank flagged for security review, which she'd been warned about. She opened it on her phone, standing in the station parking lot before her shift. The balance in her checking account read $122,047. 83. Cascade had sent the full wire. The taxes and Douglas's fee would come from this in the weeks ahead through structured transfers her new financial advisor, a woman named Helen Park who Douglas had recommended and who had a calm and systematic approach to large numbers, had already explained in 2 phone calls. She stood in the parking lot and looked at the number on her phone for a moment. Then she put her phone in her pocket and went inside and did her job. What followed was not drama. It was a series of deliberate, unglamorous decisions made by a person who had learned through experience that unglamorous decisions were the ones that actually held. She paid off the credit card first. $14,000, executed online in 3 minutes. The card that had been David's and then had been entirely hers with its $14,000 balance and its 22% interest rate. She watched the balance change to 0 and felt something release in her chest that had been tight for so long she'd stopped noticing it. She paid the medical overdue balance, called Cora's rheumatologist's office, and set up a prepaid account for the next 2 years of appointments, called the specialty pharmacy, and paid 18 months of medication forward. She paid the truck's repair bill, the brake job she'd been nursing along for 4 months. She bought a different truck, used, 3 years old, from a dealer in La Grande, paying cash and driving home in a vehicle that stopped when she asked it to without making a sound. She paid her rent 3 months ahead and told her landlord she'd be staying for at least another year, probably longer. She set aside money for Cora's future in an account structured so it would be accessible for education and medical costs and whatever else Cora needed as she grew. She did not buy a larger house. She did not move to a different city. She did not tell the people in her life what had changed, not because she was planning to hide it indefinitely, but because the change needed to settle in her before she could explain it to anyone else, and the explaining to anyone else could wait. She went back to the forest on a Saturday in June, alone, having logged the visit under the land easement provision in the settlement agreement. The forest in early summer was different from November, the undergrowth thick and green, rhododendron in bloom along the drainages, the quality of light through the canopy denser, filtered through multiple layers of new growth. She followed the trail. 9 markers. The red shoe first, which was still there on its ponderosa, the nail holding after however many decades, the canvas continuing its slow return to the elements. She'd thought about having it removed, preserved. She decided to leave it. It had been placed there to mark a beginning and had served its function and deserved to stay where it was, finishing its dissolution at whatever pace the forest chose. The cabin looked different in summer. The moss was brighter, the vegetation grown closer in the months since her last visit, the structure more thoroughly absorbed into the forest than it had appeared in November's bare clarity. She had to push through a screen of young growth to reach the door, which suggested no one had been here since the late fall. Inside, the light was different. Summer light through the frameless window, warmer, casting different shadows than the winter pallor she'd worked in. The room looked smaller somehow, or she'd been carrying it larger in her mind than it actually was. The photographs were still on the wall. She'd arranged, through Douglas and the settlement terms, for the preservation of the cabin as a historically significant site, an application she'd filed with the Oregon State Historic Preservation Office that was still pending, but that the agency's legal office had indicated they'd support given the documented history. The application cited the cabin as evidence of the longest known continuous, unauthorized habitation of national forest land in the Pacific Northwest, 23 to 30-plus years. It cited Harlan Briggs' status as a geologist who had contributed to the commercial development of the region's mineral resources. It cited the personal history documented in the journals and letters inside. Elena had been careful about what she'd said in that application and what she'd left out. The settlement's non-disclosure terms covered the specific financial details of the equity claim. They did not cover the personal history, the letters, the story of a man who had stayed because he had nowhere else to go. She had written about that honestly. She stood in front of the photographs. Clara laughing, braids half undone. Clara composed for the camera. The family at Christmas. The woman in profile. She'd looked at that photograph many times since November. She'd looked at her mother's photographs many times. The resemblance was there in the posture, the set of the jaw, though photographs from different decades and different conditions made direct comparison uncertain. She didn't need certainty anymore. The DNA report had given her certainty. What the photographs gave her was something else, something without a clean name, a sense of continuity between a woman she'd known for 16 years and a man she'd never met who had loved that woman's younger self enough to spend his life in a forest. She took the photographs down carefully. The cut nails came away from the old wood with minimal effort. She wrapped each photograph in the clean cloth she'd brought for the purpose and placed them in the flat case she'd carried up. She would have them preserved properly, digitized and restored where the fading had been significant. Printed in archival quality. One of Clara laughing would hang in her house. Not prominently, not as a declaration, but present. Available to be seen. She stood for a while in the room without the photographs, looking at the nail holes in the log wall, the impressions left by 40-plus years of wait. The room was smaller without them. More ordinary. Just a room in a deteriorating structure in a forest, which was what it had been before Harlan Briggs lived in it, and what it would remain after the preservation designation gave it a historical marker and a lock on the door. She sat on the edge of the table where the papers had been weighted by a stone, where the journals had sat, where the tin box had rested before she'd removed it to the station and changed the shape of her life. The wood was solid. The repair with the iron pipe leg had held through decades. He'd built things to last. She thought about what he'd written, a man more comfortable with geology than with grace. She understood that. She was not entirely unlike him. She was a person who found it easier to read terrain than to read people, who was better at the physical evidence of things than at their emotional architecture. She had spent 4 years after David left constructing a life from practical decisions and precise arithmetic, and the practical decisions had worked, had gotten Cora through the worst of the medical uncertainty and into the stable stretch, had gotten them through without losing anything that mattered. But she understood, sitting in the cabin in the summer light, that surviving the 4 years had cost her something she hadn't named yet. A certain narrowing of what she allowed herself to want. A certain reduction in the radius of her life, pulled in close to what was necessary and nothing beyond. She'd stopped planning ahead, stopped considering futures that extended past the current month's bills. Stopped thinking about what she'd wanted before the wanting had to stop. The money changed that. Not because the money was the thing she'd wanted, which it hadn't been, but because the money removed the constraint that had made wanting feel dangerous. You could want things when the floor was solid. You couldn't afford to when 1 month's miscalculation meant a child's medication went unpurchased. She thought about what she would do now that she could think about what she would do. The first thing was the foundation. She'd been turning it over in her mind since the settlement, in the gaps between ordinary tasks, the shape of it coming clearer over weeks of quiet consideration. Not a large institution, not immediately. Something modest and specific, built around what she knew from experience rather than theory. Single mothers in financial crisis needed 2 things before anything else: a floor and time. The floor was the emergency that stopped the hemorrhage, the security deposit that kept them out of their car, the first month's rent that kept them out of shelter. Time was what came after the floor, the period where things could stabilize if external pressure was removed. Most assistance programs addressed one or the other. Few addressed both. She'd spent the 4 years after David left calculating what she would have needed, not in the abstract, but specifically from her own experience. The answer was approximately $8,000 in immediate assistance and 4 months of subsidized rent. That amount, deployed correctly with appropriate support, could buy a woman enough floor and time to rebuild. It was not a large amount. It was smaller than most foundation grants and larger than most emergency funds. She'd work with Helen Park on the structure, endow it properly so it ran on investment income rather than annual fundraising. Keep it small and direct. No overhead staff beyond a part-time coordinator to manage applications. Review each case herself for the first few years. She'd name it after her mother. The Linda Harmon Foundation, which was the name her mother had used and the name that had been hers for most of her life. The name she'd built herself inside, even if it hadn't been the name she was born to. She sat in the cabin until the light changed, until the afternoon warmth started cooling toward the temperature that lived permanently in the old forest regardless of season. Then she picked up the flat case with the photographs and went outside. The forest was the same as it always was, patient and without opinion about the human dramas playing out its floor. She walked the trail back the way she'd come, past the rope and the tin soldier and the coffee can, past the glass bottle and the leather strap, past the tin cup on the lodgepole, and finally back to the ponderosa with the red shoe. She stood at the tree for a moment. The shoe had been there before she was born, placed by a man who loved his daughter and understood that the forest held things if you knew how to look for them, who built a trail of markers for someone he trusted would come, who was right about more things than he knew. She walked back to the truck and drove home. At dinner that evening, Cora asked what she'd done with her day off, and Elena said she'd gone back to the old house in the forest, the one she'd told her about in November. Cora, who had not forgotten, who retained things with the fidelity specific to children paying closer attention than adults realized, asked, "Did you figure out why the person left?" Elena thought about how to answer that. She'd been thinking in the abstract way of a parent who knows a conversation is coming about how to tell Cora the story. Not all of it, not yet, but enough. Children deserved to know their history in proportion to their capacity to carry it, and Cora was 7 years old and had already carried more than most. "He didn't leave," she said. "He stayed a long time. He was waiting for someone to find something he'd hidden. Did someone find it?" Elena looked at her daughter across the kitchen table. "Yes, someone found it." Cora processed this with her spoon suspended over her bowl, her feet swinging slightly beneath her, the thinking expression. Was it important? What he hid? It was. He'd worked very hard his whole life, and he wanted to make sure the right person got what he'd built. Who was the right person? Elena set down her fork. "You remember how I told you about Great-Grandpa William's old house in the story we read together last year? About how sometimes people hide things for the people who come after them?" Cora nodded. "The man in the forest was my grandfather. He was your great-great-grandfather, and he hid something that turned out to help us." Cora looked at her. Like a treasure? Kind of like a treasure. Not gold exactly. Something he'd worked for, that he wanted to stay in the family. Cora was quiet for a moment, absorbing the adjustment this required in her picture of things. Then, so he knew we'd need help? He didn't know specifically, but he trusted that whoever came would need it. and that needing it was the right reason to find it. Cora nodded, satisfied in the way of children when complicated things resolve into a principle they can file. Then she asked if she could have more pasta. Elena served her more pasta. In August, she went to Portland for Cora's rheumatology appointment. Stable again. Still stable. The rheumatologist was cautiously using a different word now alongside stable. Managed. As in, this is a managed condition. As in, we have tools, and we're using them, and they're working. Elena sat in the parking structure afterward for 6 minutes. Same as she'd done in February. Same as she'd always done after good news, because good news required its own processing time. Then she started the truck and drove to a restaurant she'd chosen in advance. A small Thai place near the hospital that Cora had mentioned 3 times over the previous 2 months, and they had dinner at a table by the window, and Cora ordered everything she wanted, and Elena did not check the prices on the menu. They walked along the waterfront afterward in the long August evening, Cora occasionally running ahead to the railing and back, the river wide and brown and moving. Elena thought about the last time she'd walked along a Portland waterfront, a different section, a different year with garbage bags and a jewelry box and $43. She thought about the distance between that evening and this one. Not in terms of money, though the money was real and its absence had been real, and its presence was real in different ways than she'd expected. The distance was harder to measure than money. It was the distance between a life contracted to what was necessary and a life that had room. Again, room for Cora to order everything she wanted. Room for Elena to look at the river without calculating anything. She had not quit her job yet. She'd told Douglas she was thinking about it, and he'd said that was her decision and that there was no financial reason to rush it. She thought about what she'd do instead, and the answer kept coming back to the same thing. The preservation work, the cabin, and other structures like it, the buildings that held history nobody had recorded properly because the people who'd lived in them had been poor or eccentric or both and hadn't been the kind of people history paid attention to. She thought she might go back to school. Not for a second degree, something shorter, a certification program in historic preservation that Oregon State offered online. She thought she might use her ranger experience, which was 9 years of understanding forests and structures and what they contained, in a direction that pointed toward memory rather than management. She thought about that without urgency. There was time now, the particular luxury of time, which she'd had very little of for 4 years, and which she was learning to use carefully, not filling it immediately with the next thing to accomplish, but letting it be what it was. Cora came running back from the railing. "Can we get ice cream?" "Yes," Elena said. "Let's get ice cream." The Linda Harmon Foundation made its first grants in October, 8 months after the settlement. 11 families in Wallowa, Baker, and Union counties, 11 cases Elena had reviewed herself using criteria she'd built from her own experience of what desperation actually required. The smallest grant was $3,400, covering a security deposit and 2 months' rent for a woman in Baker City with 2 young children who had been living in her car since her husband's arrest the previous spring. The largest was $11,200, a more complex case involving a single mother with a medically fragile child who needed both housing assistance and medical equipment not covered by her insurance. Elena had read that application 3 times. Then she'd approved it and moved to the next one. The cases accumulated slowly, which was intentional. She'd been advised by the financial structure to make no more grants in the first year than the endowment's investment income could sustain long-term. The endowment was $6 million, placed in a conservative portfolio that Helen Park managed, generating approximately $240,000 annually. Elena had established a policy of keeping the foundation's total grants under $200,000 per year to preserve buffer for operating costs and reserve. The 11 families represented $82,000 in the first quarter. She hired the part-time coordinator in January, a woman named Rose Benally who had previously run a domestic violence shelter in Pendleton and who understood, from direct experience, what it meant to need the floor and the time, and nothing more. Rose asked no unnecessary questions and wrote case summaries that were precise without being clinical and called Elena When something in an application was genuinely ambiguous rather than making decisions she wasn't sure about. The work felt like the right use of the money. Not because it was charitable, not because it produced a feeling of virtue, but because it was the specific application of a specific resource to a specific problem Elena understood from the inside out. You couldn't design better assistance than the kind designed by someone who had needed it. She thought about Harlan sometimes, while she was reviewing applications. About what he'd written. I want you to understand why the tin box exists and why I left it the way I did. She thought he would have approved of what she was doing with it, though she couldn't know that and didn't need to. She was doing what made sense, which was the only standard she'd ever had. She visited the cabin in October again, after the first grants went out, a personal visit with no professional purpose. The preservation designation had come through in September, and the agency had installed a small weather-resistant placard near the door explaining the site's historical significance. The placard was tasteful and brief. It mentioned Harlan Briggs, geologist, without specifying what had happened to him. It noted the cabin had been continuously occupied from approximately 1968 to the early 1990s by the land's previous private owner. The nails were still in the wall where the photographs had been. She didn't replace them with anything. The absence seemed right. The record of what had hung there was now in archival storage in Portland, and one image of her mother as a girl, the one where she was laughing at something off camera, her braids slightly undone, was framed on the wall of Elena's living room, where Cora walked past it every day. Cora had asked about it once. Elena had told her it was her grandmother when she was small. Cora had looked at it for a moment and said she had mom's eyes and gone back to whatever she was doing. Elena had stood for a moment in front of the photograph and thought about that. About her mother, who had spent 40 years not knowing she'd been Clara Jean Briggs, who had touched a scar on her knee without knowing its history, who had closed a book she couldn't remember opening. About what it would have meant to her, or whether it would have meant anything, to know that her father had stayed in the forest looking. She thought the knowing might not have helped, that some things sealed themselves for a reason, and the sealing was its own kind of survival. Her mother had built a life inside the name Linda Harmon, and it had been a real life, imperfect and quiet and finished too early, and the name she was born with was a different thing, separate, belonging to a history she hadn't had access to. What Elena had was the inheritance, not the money specifically, though the money was real and was doing real things. The inheritance was the longer story. A geologist who read rock and trusted the future and built a trail through the forest for someone he didn't know yet, who turned out to be his granddaughter, who turned out to need it, who turned out to be humble enough to follow where it led. She didn't think she was special for having found it. She'd been doing her job, following a patrol route she'd walked 100 times, and the November light had caught a red shoe at the right angle, and she'd gotten out of the truck. Anyone else might have gotten out of the truck. Anyone else might have followed the arrow. She'd happened to be the one who needed it badly enough to keep going. That was what Harlan had understood. Not that the right person would have particular qualities, but that the right person would be desperate enough to pay attention. Desperation as a form of perception. The way the drowning noticed the rope while the comfortable miss it entirely. She walked back through the forest toward the truck on the October afternoon, the trail familiar now, each marker logged in her memory in sequence. The cup, the bottle, the soldier, the rope. The shoe on the ponderosa, patient in its slow dissolution, the cut nail holding through whatever remained. She thought about Cora, who was in school right now, 7 years old and stable and asking for ice cream, who would grow up knowing she'd come from something, that there was history behind her deeper than she could see, that someone had paid attention and left a trail. Not because wealth was the inheritance that mattered, but because the attention was the staying. The refusal to leave. She got in the truck and drove back through the afternoon light that turned the eastern hills amber, the truck stopping when she asked it to, the road quiet under good tires, the mountains in her rear view holding their shapes against the sky, steady as geology, unchanged by whatever the human lives at their feet had amounted to or failed to amount to or finally, after everything, managed to find. Douglas called in February of the following year with news she hadn't anticipated. One of the other families from Cascades' 2004 shareholder memo had found her. Not through Douglas, and not through any public record she'd been party to. Through the historic preservation application, which had been approved the previous fall and filed with the state as public record, citing Harlan John Briggs by name as the cabin's occupant and the parcel's last private owner. A man in Missoula named Gerald Canton had been searching for that name periodically for 15 years. He was 64 years old. His grandfather had been the Canton and Briggs Canton Mineral Survey, the same survey operation Harlan had run in Baker County. Gerald had a box of his grandfather's papers that included references to a business partner named Briggs and a shares in a venture that had never produced anything Gerald could trace. He had written a letter to the Oregon State Historic Preservation Office asking if they had contact information for whoever had filed the application. The SHPO had forwarded his letter to the ranger station, which had forwarded it to Elena. She called Douglas immediately. His response was measured. The other accounts in Cascade's memo are separate from your settlement. You signed a release of your own claims, not a release on behalf of other shareholders you had no knowledge of. Gerald Canton, if his grandfather was a co-holder of Briggs Canton shares, may have a parallel claim entirely independent of yours. What should I do? That's your decision. You could ignore the letter. Nothing in your settlement requires you to facilitate other claims. Or you could call him, share what you know publicly, and let him find his own attorney. What you cannot do is assign him any portion of your settlement or guarantee him any outcome. She called Gerald Canton that evening. He picked up on the second ring, his voice carrying the particular quality of someone who had been waiting for a call without being certain it would come. She told him what she knew: the cabin, the markers, the tin box, the documentary history. She told him about Douglas and gave him Douglas's number. She told him the name of the filing attorney Cascade had used, which was public information from the court proceedings. She told him that whatever his grandfather had held, the path to determining its value ran through Cascade's internal records, which had been partly produced under court order, and which Douglas could tell him how to access. Gerald Canton was quiet for a long moment after she finished. Then he said his grandfather had died in 1981 believing he'd been cheated out of something but not knowing exactly what. That the papers in the box had been passed down through the family as a kind of unsolved question. That Gerald had made a periodic habit of searching the name Briggs without ever finding anything useful. He said thank you in a way that meant more than the two words. She said she hoped it worked out. She meant it. She didn't follow up. It wasn't her story to follow. Cora turned 9 in April. The birthday dinner she requested was pasta, which had been her answer for 3 years running, and Elena made it at home with the good olive oil she now bought without checking the price, which still struck her as slightly unreal, the absence of checking prices. The small luxuries were the ones that registered most, not the large purchases which had a decisiveness to them that made them easy to process. The small ones, the olive oil and the extra book at the bookstore, and the prescription filled the same day it was called in rather than 3 days later when the account recovered. Those were what told her the circumstances had changed. After dinner, while Cora was eating birthday cake she'd chosen herself from the bakery in town, a lemon cake with buttercream roses she'd pointed to through the glass with absolute certainty, she asked a question that had clearly been sitting with her for a while. Did great-great-grandpa Harlan know he had a granddaughter? Elena considered the question carefully. He knew my mom existed, but he didn't know she was his daughter. He suspected it, I think. The way he set things up, the letter he left, suggests he thought someone from his family might come. But he couldn't be certain. Why didn't he just find out? Elena had thought about this many times. She still didn't have a clean answer. I think he was afraid, not of finding out, but of what finding out would require him to do afterward. If he knew for certain that my mom was alive and was his daughter, he'd have had to decide whether to approach her. And approaching her meant disrupting a life she'd built without knowing where it came from. Cora processed this with the fork resting against her plate. That seems sad, to know someone is out there and not talk to them. It is sad, Elena said. He made a wrong call, probably, but he made it because he was trying to protect her, even if protecting her wasn't what she would have chosen for herself. Do you think she would have wanted to know? Elena looked at her daughter, 9 years old, asking questions that Elena was still working through herself. I think she would have, but by the time there was a way to find out, she was gone. Cora was quiet for a moment. Then, I'm glad you found the shoe. Elena leaned over and straightened the buttercream rose that had started sliding off Cora's piece of cake. So am I. The foundation's second year brought 340 applications from 6 counties in Oregon and Idaho. Rose had developed a triage system that Elena had approved, sorting cases into 3 categories based on immediate need, medium-term stability risk, and long-term support requirement. The foundation addressed the first category directly with emergency grants, partnered with existing organizations for the second, and maintained a referral list for the third. One application in June came from a woman in La Grande. Her name was Teresa Odom, 31 years old, one daughter age 6, recently widowed after her husband's death from a workplace accident. The accident was under investigation. The employer's insurance company had frozen the workers' compensation claim pending outcome of the investigation, which their attorney estimated could take 12 to 18 months. Teresa was 3 months behind on rent. Her daughter had started first grade but had begun refusing to go on Mondays, which Teresa described in the application as her daughter knowing that Mondays were when the landlord sometimes called. Elena read that line twice. A 6-year-old calibrating fear to a weekly schedule, learning the grammar of financial precariousness before she had words for it. She approved the application at the maximum emergency grant, $12,000, and wrote a note in the file for Rose to follow up personally within 30 days and again at 90. She wrote in the notes column, "Daughter needs stability before anything else. Get the rent secured and stop the clock on the fear." Rose called her that afternoon. The Odom case. The landlord will accept 3 months' payment to restore the lease and remove the arrears. But Teresa is also in conversation with a legal aid attorney about the workers' comp claim. If that resolves, her situation changes significantly. Good. Fund the rent. And flag this for a legal aid partnership so her attorney knows we're supporting the housing while she fights the claim. She thought about Teresa Odom for a few days after. About the 6-year-old who knew that Mondays were dangerous. About how quickly children absorbed the emotional texture of financial precariousness and built their interior landscape around it. Cora had done the same thing in the years when things were tight, learning not to ask for things, learning to read her mother's face before making requests, learning the grammar before Elena had understood how fluent she'd become in it. She thought about what it meant to interrupt that learning early enough that the grammar didn't become the child's native language. That was what the floor and the time actually bought. Not just rent paid and crisis averted. The chance for the child to stop reading the room for evidence of disaster and start reading the room for other things. Homework and friendships, and the particular absorption of a 6-year-old in something that interested her. She wrote a small note in her personal file. Not for the foundation, just for herself. It said, "The grants are not about the money. The money is the mechanism. What we're buying is the attention the child gets to pay to something other than fear." She kept the note in the same drawer where she kept her mother's wristwatch and her birth certificate and Cora's old hospital wristbands. The drawer that held things without a better category. In July, she enrolled in the Historic Preservation Certificate Program. The coursework was online, manageable alongside the ranger work. She was still doing 3 days a week, having negotiated a reduced schedule that her supervisor, Garrett's replacement, had accepted without particular argument. The program covered documentation methodology, structural assessment, archival research, the regulatory landscape for federal and state designation processes. She found the archival research component interesting in a way that surprised her slightly. The practice of finding evidence of lives and documents that had been filed by people who expected them to be routine. Tax records and deed transfers and court filings. The ordinary administrative residue of a life, which when read carefully often revealed what the person themselves might not have thought to record. She thought about Harlan's journals, which she'd had transcribed by a historical linguist in Portland who specialized in mid-century handwriting. She'd read the transcriptions 3 times. They were not dramatic documents. They were records of daily weather and repair work and observations about the forest. Occasional notes about what he'd seen or heard from the direction of the road. Entries that mention Clara by name 2 or 3 times a year, never more than a sentence. The way you mention someone whose absence had become part of the landscape rather than an event. March 12, 1983. Saw 2 elk on the North Ridge. Cold again tonight. Thought of Clara. That was a complete entry. Thought of Clara. As if thinking of her was a fact that needed logging, a weather observation, something that had happened and been noted and would be noted again. She had that entry framed. Small frame, plain wood, in her bedroom where she saw it in the morning and sometimes at night. Not as a declaration of anything, just as a record that the thinking had happened, that someone had thought of someone, that the thought had been worth writing down. Cora saw it one morning and read it, and asked who had written it. Elena told her it was great-great-grandpa Harlan. Cora read it again, still in her pajamas, her hair not yet brushed. Then she said, quietly and without drama, that she thought that was nice, that he wrote it down. Elena agreed that it was. She went to make coffee, and Cora went to get ready for school. And the morning proceeded in its ordinary shape, the way mornings did, carrying small things inside them that only became visible when you looked back later and understood what they had contained. Stories like this remind us that starting over is terrifying, but it is always possible. If you or someone you love is facing a total reset right now, whether from a divorce, a loss, or a financial disaster, you need a plan. Scan the QR code on your screen or click the link below to get the Phoenix Blueprint for just $17. It gives you the exact steps you need to take in the first 48 hours and a 90-day plan to get your independence back. Thank you for watching.